Hey there, fellow snack hunters. Tonight, we're diving into something wildly off-beata topic, so sticky, crispy, and downright medieval that you won't want to miss a single bite. Picture this: a world without golden arches, vending machines, or convenience stores yet. Somehow, folks still manage to get their greasy fix. Trust me, this journey is going to leave you drooling and maybe a little queasy. So, hit that like button if you're in for a tasty time, and do me a favor, subscribe if you're vibing with these oddball tales I spin. Drop a comment below with where you're listening from and the hour of your midnight snack hunt, because you know I love seeing snackers from every corner of this crumbly world. Now, lean back, turn on a crackling campfire soundtrack for that medieval echo, and let's get into the grubby heart of history. Imagine a time when half the food looked suspicious, tasted worse, and might just give you a reason to see your local plague doctor. But every so often, something sweet and greasy broke through the dreariness sapple fluffs, hot and dangerous, were the era's sugary triumph. These crispy golden bites, called apple gobbles, in the murky days of Old Brixham, our imaginary medieval town, were basically the medieval donut minus the frosting, minus the hygiene, plus a whole lot of flair. So, what made these apple gobbles so special? First off, forget the glossy supermarket apples you're used to. These were tart, rough-skinned orbs stolen from behind the local brew barn, with names like Knobby Bessie or Thorny Jane. Once in hand, they were chopped up, tossed into a sloppy batter of grain flour, eggs from chickens who'd seen better days, and when the water was too dicey to trust a splash of bitter ale to kill the flavor of everything else. Because, let's be honest, if you're living in a town where your neighbor's goat might wander into your bedroom at night, you'd want your snack to taste like something. The real drama started when it hit the sizzling cauldron of pig drippings. That's right, folks' recycled lard was the secret sauce of medieval cooking. This stuff was reused until it practically had a family name, but it lent a distinct porky perfume to every bite. The result? A crispy, bubbly outer shell with a soft, piping hot center, sweet enough to make you forget you were basically eating a medieval science experiment. If you were flush with coin, your apple gobbles might even get a dusting of imported cane crystal saka sugar, which doubled as a medieval flex. Otherwise, a drizzle of foraged honey or a sticky spiced syrup made from dubious ingredients did the trick. The final taste? Like someone took your grandmother's pie and added a shot of adventure and maybe some mild fear of food poisoning. These gobbles were the kind of treat you'd find sizzling away at the dusty market square, sold by a winking hag with questionable hygiene. Or maybe outside the local chapel, where devout souls would snag a piping hot bite before repenting for the rest of their week's sins. Kids adored them, adults devoured them, and pigeons staged heists for them. Let's face it, if there was ever a moment to risk a third-degree burn, this was it. But not every apple gobble was a masterpiece. Sometimes the apples were so tart, they made your teeth squeal in protest, or the batter turned to glue halfway through. And let's not even get into the batch fried in oil so rancid it had its own personality. Still, when they were good, you understood why anyone put up with medieval life. Now, if apple gobbles were the medieval donut, then cheese poppers were the bite-sized, squeaky counterpart or ancestors' version of popcorn, if you will. These pale lumps of curdled milk, known to the townsfolk as whey lumps, didn't look like much, but they squeaked on your teeth like a medieval puppet show. Medieval cheese wasn't designed to impress the in-laws at dinner. It was churned out in a hurry, devoured even faster, and expected to endure everything from swampy cellars to goat-foot traffic. Cheese poppers were just the newborn stage of cheese young, soft, and ready to be squished in your palm. They were made by stirring up a fresh pot of milk, adding a little scrap of stomach lining, because, surprise, medieval rennet was basically a cow's baby blanket, and letting it do its curd magic. The end result was a mouthful of squeaky, slightly salty, lumpsome rubbery, some tender, some so fresh they squeaked louder than a rat in church. They were perfect for the harried traveler on the road, the monk who needed a break from chanting, or the farm kid who'd rather eat these than another bowl of watery porridge. Let's be real, they didn't taste amazing, but in a world where snacks usually meant stale bread and questionable ale, they felt like a luxury. You could fry them up for an extra crispy edge, sprinkle them over a bubbling stew, or just stuff them in your mouth by the handful while telling yourself it was better than barn air. Unlike so many of the fussy feasts of the time, cheese poppers didn't need a special festival or an invitation from the local baron. They were there for you on your darkest, hungriest day. Did they sometimes taste like old socks? Sure. But in a land where the concept of freshness was as wobbly as a medieval wagon wheel, people just shrugged it off. With enough salt and a pinch of optimism, everything was edible. And if it wasn't, well, maybe you just needed to drink more ale. Of course, cheese poppers weren't the only questionable treat in this medieval mess. Enter the mighty turnip puffer dish, so odd you'd swear it was invented by a desperate peasant who'd just watched their last apple roll away. Let's get one thing straight. Turnips are not dessert. But in a world where sugar was a luxury for lords, and apples were gone with the wind by autumn, desperate times called for desperate pies. Some enterprising soul, maybe in the bustling kitchen of the moldy Turnip Inn, took a battered turnip and thought, what if we turned this into pie? And so, the turnip puff was born part pudding, part pastry, and entirely confusing. At best, these puffs were tender, warm, and kind of sweet like a root vegetable lullaby. At worst, they were gritty, bitter, and tasted like someone tried to turn animal feed into a Sunday treat. But hey, in a town where the only other dessert option was day-old bread porridge, these humble pies were better than nothing. The recipe was straightforward, if not suspicious. Mashed turnips, hopefully not too wormy, beaten eggs, and maybe if the cook was feeling fancy, some honey or dried orchard bits. All of this was bundled in a rugged, no-nonsense crust of flour and water, then baked to a golden brown by the glow of a crackling hearth. Add a sprinkle of nutmeg if you were rich, or a slap of pepper if your cook had a mischievous streak. If the monastery kitchens were feeling extra experimental, a handful of raisins might wander in, confusing everyone in the process. The turnip puff never got a seat at the baron's table nobles, only touched it when slumming it for a laugh or trying to seem relatable to their dirt-caked subjects. But for the common folk, it was the closest they got to a sweet ending for a meal of cabbage stew and stale bread. It wasn't exactly cheesecake, but it tridened in medieval Europe that counted for something. You'd find turnip puffs sizzling away in the market lanes, stacked on the feast tables of harvest festivals, or tucked into the corner of a monk's larder where thyme and turnips were both in suspicious surplus. And even though some batches tasted like compost heap dreams, people still loved them, or at least didn't hate them enough to stop making them. They were cheap, filling, and just sweet enough to be dessert in a world that didn't have much time for cake. And that's where our journey of medieval munchies begins tonight, my curious companions. We've only scratched the surface of this odd, grease-stained culinary telesso. Stay tuned, because up next, we're going to dig deeper into the world of medieval snacking, where the only constant was that if it squeaked, squished, or crunched, someone probably found a way to fry it. Hungry yet? Good, because this ride is just getting started. All right, feast seekers, gather round for a tale of medieval culinary wizardry where today's comfort foods had their distant cousins in a world of dirt roads, dusty feasts, and the occasional suspicious ingredient. We're talking about the snack that changed the game for grub on the Gano, not the greasy fried wonders we explored before today. It's all about the meat pouch, a medieval marvel that was half meal, half mystery, and all sorts of deliciously reckless. If the Middle Ages had a trophy for best traveling snack, the meat pouch would have snagged the golden ladle. Picture this, a hearty little pie, stuffed with seasoned scraps of whatever animal had the misfortune of wandering too close to the cook's knife, then folded up in a thick pastry crust, baked to a toasty brown or a slightly charred black, depending on how long the baker forgot about it in the oven. Imagine a hot pocket but medieval, no microwave, no frozen aisles, just pure, unfiltered survival instinct wrapped in bread. The true genius of the meat pouch lay in its practicality. It was your personal lunchbox that didn't need a fancy container. You could munch it while trudging down the muddy roads to the next village, nibble away as you tilled the fields, or even chomp down during the medieval version of a town fun day, aka the local gallows show. Because let's be real, in a world where your bread doubled as a plate and handkerchief, a sealed pastry pouch was borderline luxury. That crust wasn't just for show either. It kept the precious filling safe from the dirt, the wandering vermin, and your neighbor's curious sneeze. And oh, that filling. The term meat was flexible, let's say. If you lived within sniffing distance of a lord's hunting grounds, you might luck out with pork, mutton, or even venison. But if you were just another dusty soul scrabbling for dinner, you'd get rabbit, pigeon, snake, or the town's beloved hedgehog. Anything with legs or slithers was fair game for a medieval chef's knife. It was the original don't ask, just eat philosophy. Spices, those magical sprinkles of distraction, were your only real hope of masking the truth. Pepper, sage, garlic, anything to stop your tongue from guessing how many days the meat had been aging in the larder. And while modern fridges are a luxury we take for granted, back then, you had to roll with whatever didn't smell too far gone. Even so, these pouches were a prize. In a world where lunch usually meant stale bread or cold turnip mash, a steaming meat pouch was a slice of comfort even if you had to share it with the rats afterward. And don't forget these savory bundles had a veggie cousin, too. On fasting days or when your soul needed a break from questionable animal parts, cooks would fill the pouch with mashed root veggies, leeks, or crumbly curdled cheese. Still warm, still wrapped up, but gentler on the gut and the conscience. For the working folks, especially the miners and road builders, the meat pouch was more than a meal, it was a personal claim. They'd carve a symbol or initials into the crust, so everyone knew whose snack was whose. In some towns, one edge of the crust was intentionally made thick enough to be gripped by filthy hands, then broken off and tossed to the spirits, or the waiting rat army. It was practical, it was rugged, and it was a meal that didn't give a single care about fancy cutlery. So, were they tasty? Usually, yes. Were they shady? Always. But that was the thrill of it biting into a mystery you didn't want solved. Now, let's pivot to another treat, something tiny, sweet, and surprisingly lethal to your dental health. Enter the herbal crunchies. A medieval attempt at mouth fresheners before toothpaste was a glimmer in the world's eye. Tiny, sugary, and vaguely botanical, these crunchy seeds were equal parts candy, digestion remedy, and dental disaster. Crafted by candy makers who had a flair for the dramatic herbal crunchies, were fennel seeds dipped in molten sugar, boiled, beaten, and drizzled until they wore a sweet, glossy coat like medieval disco balls. Sugar was a luxury, so these treats were usually for those with enough coin to import the precious white crystals. In the homes of the well-off, herbal crunchies would be set out in dainty bowls after feasts, a fancy flourish to cover up the leftover goose grease and questionable mutton breath. Fennel seeds themselves had a bold, licorice flavor that either made you swoon or made you swallow them whole to avoid tasting them. But the sugar coating was the real showstopper on bite, and you'd either get a sweet crunch or a trip to the blacksmith to mend a cracked tooth. Medieval folks didn't just chew them mindlessly. They approached each crunchy like it was a duel with their molars. Nibble carefully, listen for the faint crack, then commit if you dared. For common folk who didn't have a sugar stash, there were knockoff versions made with honey, crushed herbs, and a prayer to Saint Sweet-Tooth. These homemade options didn't have the same sparkle, but they gave the illusion of refinement, a rare treat for someone who'd spent the day knee-deep in pig slop. In the grand lineup of medieval snackery, herbal crunchies didn't fill your belly, but they left your mouth feeling vaguely fancier, like you'd just been to the noble's table, even if your tunic still smelled like barn. And speaking of sticky sweet indulgence, let's not forget the reigning champion of medieval dessert tables, the honey brick. Also known as the honey loaf by those who'd lost too many teeth on them, this dense cake was the crown jewel of feasts, fairs, and impromptu food fights. Honey was the sweetener of the people, provided you weren't terrified of climbing a tree and getting stung into next Tuesday. Medieval bakers would mix coarse ground grain, water, and generous globs of honey to create a dough that was both a dessert and a weapon. Because, let's be real, these cakes were dense enough to stop a charging boar if wielded correctly. Once baked, honey bricks were chewy, sweet, and prone to sticking to your fingers, your face, and any other surface you dared to eat them near. If the cook had access to rare spices, nutmeg, cinnamon, or clove, the humble honey brick could become a legend whispered about for weeks. Toss in some dried fruit, if the local children hadn't snatched them for themselves, and suddenly you had a treat that was both a delicacy and a minor hazard to your dental well-being. These cakes weren't just for fancy feasts, they were the ultimate festival snack, perfect for bribes, for apologizing to your angry neighbor, or even for passive-aggressive gifting. Here, I baked this for you. It's sweet, unlike you, subtle medieval shade at its finest. Structurally, honey bricks weren't delicate. Slicing them required a sturdy blade and the patience of a monk in prayer. But once cracked open, they offered a dense, comforting chew that stuck to your ribs and your teeth in equal measure. They didn't spoil quickly, didn't crumble under rough handling, and could survive being flung across a banquet hall by an enthusiastic bard. That kind of staying power made them the MVP of the medieval dessert game. So there you have it, a whole new chapter in the saga of medieval snacking. From the mysterious, meaty pouches that doubled as travel companions to the tooth-chipping herbal crunchies and the sweet, sticky honey bricks that could outlast an argument with your local innkeeper, the medieval world knew how to treat itself. It was messy, it was risky, and it was always, always delicious, at least if you didn't think about it too hard. Stick around, my brave snack seekers. Next up, we'll be delving even deeper into the weirder corners of medieval dining, where you'll find treats that might just make you appreciate your modern fridge and your dentist even more. Hungry for more? Good, because this medieval kitchen never closes. All right, brave eaters and medieval misfits, grab a seat by the flickering hearth, because tonight we're going even deeper into the deliciously oddball world of historical snacking. Picture yourself in a cramped hall lit by tallow candles, the air thick with wood smoke and the faint hope that no one's watching you wrestle with your latest culinary adventure. Because let's be real, some of these medieval bites required more determination than skill. Take the so-called honey slabs of the medieval world, those dense, sticky cakes that looked like they'd been built to last a siege. Fluffy? Not a chance. These hefty blocks of sweetness were designed to endure medieval life, doubling as a snack and, if necessary, a weapon. Thick as a castle wall and coated in enough honey to make you feel like you'd lost a battle with a very angry beehive, these cakes were no delicate patisserie. But oh, when you managed to gnaw off a piece, it was like biting into a tiny sunbeam. They tasted of warmth, indulgence, and the rare fleeting joy of a treat that didn't involve boiled cabbage or chasing a rat out of your pantry. These honey-laden monoliths were the stuff of tavern songs and peasant daydreams, each chewy bite an echo of happier times when your only worry was whether the local brew was too flat to drink. They weren't easy to eat or easy on your teeth, but they were worth it, like the medieval equivalent of cardio. Each chew a workout for your jaw and a sweet reward for your effort. But for every golden honey slab, there was another snack born out of practicality and a refusal to waste even the strangest scraps. Enter the humble but oddly addictive fish skin crackles. Yes, you heard that right, crispy, salty ribbons of fish skin, the medieval world's answer to modern potato chips. These weren't born from culinary genius so much as a desperate cook staring at a pile of fish skins and thinking, well, might as well fry it. A quick dunk in sizzling fat, probably from the same pig that had already contributed to half the kitchen's other dishes, and suddenly those dubious scraps became something crunchy, salty, and almost elegant. Fish skins were everywhere in medieval fishing towns and river villages, where the daily catch meant herring, cod, or whatever else had wandered too close to the nets. The fish itself went to feed hungry bellies, the heads to feed hungry cats, and the skin, well, that was where the snack magic happened. Toss those skins into a pan of bubbling oil, and they'd crisp up like the first crackle of a winter fire. A sprinkle of salt brought them to life, and a pinch of garlic or wild herbs transformed them from humble scraps to culinary confidence. Soldiers carried them on long marches, sailors nibbled them on endless sea voyages, and enterprising market vendors hawked them outside boisterous taverns to soak up the ale-fueled singing of the local drunks. Sure, they sometimes still had a few scales clinging on like stubborn barnacles, and yes, they might twist into strange alien shapes in the pan more than enough to make you question your life choices. But for medieval folk, they were a crunchy, flavor-packed snack that didn't spoil easily and gave you just the right amount of energy to keep hauling firewood or defending your sheep from your neighbor's sheep-thieving ways. The only real downside? The smell. Fry up a batch indoors, and your little thatched hut would reek like Neptune's laundry basket for a week. But let's be honest, if it tasted good, you'd put up with a bit of fishy perfume. And when the day was done, and your mead was running low, there was one more comfort food waiting in the wings bread soaked in ale. A medieval dish so gloriously sloppy, it practically laughed in the face of etiquette. Known to some as soups or trench toast, this was the original peasant's comfort food, proof that you could make something edible out of the day's stale crusts and a splash of fermented grain. Here's how it worked. Take a chunk of bread that could double as a blunt instrument, drop it into a bowl of ale that had been brewed in the back room of a smoky inn, and let the bread do its thing, soak, swell, and soften until it was finally soft enough to chew. This wasn't your fancy craft ale with notes of citrus and a story behind every sip. This was raw, low-alcohol ale, made in barrels that probably had more mystery than flavor. The transformation was real. Stale bread turned into a warm, spongy bite that didn't actively insult your taste buds. It was quick, filling, and messy enough to feel like a genuine break from the day's back-breaking labor. Allebread soups were especially beloved by the hard-working classes, the farmers, the field hands, the weary travelers who didn't have time for dainty courses or fancy cutlery. Just a hunk of bread, a splash of ale, and a bit of hope that dinner would stay down. If you were feeling fancy, or if the cook had a moment of inspiration, you might toss in a few extras, a pinch of herbs, a sprinkle of cheese, or even a fried egg if the hen had been generous that morning. On festival days, soups might even be dunked in spiced ale, a rare treat that involved a shaving of nutmeg or a dash of cinnamon, turning your humble supper into something bordering on festive. Like so much of medieval cooking, soups had a second life beyond just filling bellies. It was the ultimate waste-not dish. Stale bread too hard to chew? Soak it. Ale starting to turn? Pour it on bread. Every crumb and every drop had a job. The only catch? Soaked bread didn't travel well. Once it reached that perfect mushy stage, you had to eat it fast, risk turning your meal into a soggy metaphor for lost opportunities. Still, for a cold night by the fire, nothing beat a steaming bowl of ale bread mush and the quiet satisfaction that even the humblest ingredients could turn into something comforting. But here's where the story gets even weirder. If you think soaking bread in ale was the pinnacle of medieval oddities, let me introduce you to the ultimate in wine-soaked confusion. Winesops. Imagine taking bread, preferably the kind that's seen better days, dipping it in sweetened, spiced wine that's been lurking in a clay jug since last year's harvest, and calling it dessert. This wasn't your casual snack. This was a dish for those candlelit banquets where the air was thick with music and intrigue. The bread was usually toasted, or at least not so stale it would chip a tooth, then dunked in warm, fragrant wine until it reached a texture somewhere between pudding and porridge. The upper crust called it refined. The lower classes called it suspicious. You didn't eat winesops with your fingers. No, this was a spoon-only affair, something you savored in small, slow bites while pretending you weren't eavesdropping on the latest scandal at the next table. In noble halls, winesops were part of the show of final flourish to the feast, a sign of status and culinary adventure. For everyone else, it was a curiosity, a dish that said, yes, we've run out of ideas, but we still have wine, let's do this. Did it taste good? If you liked the warming bite of spiced wine and didn't mind your bread turning to mush, sure. But let's be honest, this was less about flavor and more about making do. stretching every last drop of the feast until the guests were too tipsy to care. So, my curious snackers, here's your takeaway from tonight's medieval kitchen tales. The line between comfort food and culinary gamble was thin and crumbly. From sticky honey slabs to crispy fish skin crackles, from ale-soaked bread lumps to wine-drenched sops, the medieval world knew how to turn scraps into something worth gathering around a fire for. And that's just a taste of what these rough and rowdy kitchens could produce. Next time, we'll venture even further into the spicy, the fermented, and the downright bizarre. So stay tuned and keep those medieval taste buds ready, because in a world without fridges, snack time was never boring. All right, my curious culinary explorers tonight, we're back at the long wooden table of medieval snackery, ready to uncover the next tier of this world's most questionable delicacies. Picture yourself in the corner of a candlelit feast, soggy toast in a goblet at your elbow, and the quiet hope that no one notices you're about to chew your way through another medieval mystery. When done well, these wine-soaked bread bites, known in some dusty corners of our fictional medieval kingdom as noble soakers, were warm, rich, and faintly intoxicating. Like a gentle lullaby after a long day of toiling in the fields, the wine brought warmth and richness. The bread added a comforting chew. Spices lent an air of sophistication, like you'd been personally invited to the baron's table, even if you were still wearing yesterday's boots. But let's be honest, when done poorly, this was wet bread in a bowl. No amount of cinnamon could hide the fact that you were basically eating medieval sadness. Some cooks added dried fruits or nuts for a flourish. Others got a little too creative, tossing in cheese, or brace yourself, a whole egg. At that point, it stopped being dessert and started being a culinary guessing game that might leave you rethinking your life choices. For peasants, there were knockoff versions of noble soakers, stale bread dunked in vinegar or the cheapest ale they could find. It wasn't dessert, it was dinner, breakfast, or whatever you called a meal that was more confusing than comforting. Still, there was something about these bread-wine mashups. They were warm, filling, and gave everyone a tiny taste of luxury even if it tasted faintly of moldy regret. But let's shift gears. In the murky world of medieval pantries, dried fruit was the kind of prize that could start a family feud. Sugary, a little exotic, and rugged enough to survive a sea voyage or a rowdy monastery brawl, dried fruit was the ultimate medieval treasure. Just don't expect a cute snack. Packed, these dried morsels were aggressive in texture and suspiciously tough. The usual suspects were always there: raisins, figs, dates, and if you'd really hit the jackpot, imported prunes. These shriveled gems were either sun-dried, smoked over questionable fires, or simply forgotten on a window ledge until they gave up any pretense of juiciness. They were dense, wrinkled, and determined to last longer than most marriages of the time, like edible time capsules from last year's orchard. Sure, dried fruit was sweet, almost too sweet for the average medieval palate, but biting into one was an adventure. Figs came with seeds that worked as DIY dental floss. Dates had a stickiness that could glue your teeth together for hours. And raisins? Those little devils would wedge themselves into your molars and refuse to leave. Subtlety was not in their job description, but they had their place. Nobles would wrap them in flaky pastry, drizzle them with rose water, or soak them in spiced wine for an exotic treat to impress their fancy guests. In humbler kitchens, dried fruit was a rare treat, pulled out for holidays, weddings, or the one day of the year someone remembered your name. You'd savor each bite like it was gold, slowly, carefully, possibly while hiding in the barn so no one asked you to share. Storage was easy enough. These chewy gems went into cloth sacks or little clay pots, safe from rats and kids alike. They'd harden with time, turning from chewy to outright crunchy, a long-lasting snack, or, if you were a younger sibling, a handy projectile. Because in the medieval world, everything had at least two uses. So dried fruit was a prized treat, luxurious, sweet, and faintly dangerous. One bite and it stuck with you, sometimes literally. Now, if you woke up hungry on a chilly morning and needed something to fill the void, Forget your dreams of pancakes stacked high with maple syrup and whipped cream. Medieval pancakes were a different beast, altogether thinner, tougher, and fried in enough lard to make your arteries beg for mercy. But compared to a watery turnip soup that barely had the will to live, these rustic flat cakes were a glorious break from the routine. Made from a basic mix of ground grain, eggs, and water or ale, these pancakes were cooked on a sizzling iron slab until they took on a rugged, crispy edge. No fancy griddles here, just a battered pan greased with sizzling pig fat and a lot of medieval optimism. The result? A pancake that was chewy in the center, crisp around the edges, and tough enough to survive a bumpy horseback ride. Sometimes they were burnt around the edges. Sometimes they were raw in the middle. Often they were both. But that was part of the charm, no. Two pancakes were ever the same. Flavor came from whatever you had on hand. A dash of ale added a welcome tang. A spoonful of honey turned a simple breakfast into a festival of sweetness. If you were feeling adventurous, a sprinkle of herbs or a few slivers of onion turned your pancake into a daring new dish. These medieval flapjacks were democratic. Peasants, nobles, monks, traveling merchants, everyone loved them. Some layered them with cheese, others dunked them in broth, and plenty just rolled them up and tore into them like the world was ending. There was no wrong way to eat a medieval pancake, just a lot of ways to get your hands greasy. But let's talk about the truly brave, those who took snacking to a whole new level of intensity, the blood pudding ball. A dense, iron-rich medieval powerhouse that made modern sausage rolls look like delicate finger food. These were born from the grim but practical idea that no part of the animal should go to waste, even the parts that might make you a little squeamish. The process was simple. If you didn't mind a bit of squeamishness, start with fresh animal blood. Pigs were common, but really, any blood would do. Stir in oats, chopped onions, a slab of beef fat, and enough spices to chase away second thoughts. The mixture turned into a thick, sticky porridge that could haunt your dreams if you thought about it too hard. From there, it was rolled into balls firm enough to hold their shape, bold enough to scare off timid eaters. Then came the hot fat, the crackling, the transformation, the outside crisped up to a dark, crunchy shell that glistened in the flickering firelight. Inside, rich, meaty warmth that was both comforting and, let's be honest, a bit unsettling. You'd taste iron, earth, and the faint suggestion of something primal. Not for the faint of heart, but undeniably filling. For the wealthy, blood pudding balls were dressed up with pepper, maybe served alongside eggs and a tankard of ale. For the poor, they were just a hot, greasy bite that didn't taste like boiled cabbage, and that was enough. You could eat one and skip lunch. Eat two, and you'd power through a day of hauling logs. Eat four, well, maybe you were trying to win a bet. Markets, fairs, roadside stalls, wherever there was a medieval crowd, there were blood pudding balls waiting to test your stomach's resolve. Especially in the colder months, when warmth mattered more than squeamishness. Not everyone loved them, of course. Some folks found the texture challenging. Others couldn't get past the fact that they were basically biting into coagulated life force. But in a world where survival trumped squeamishness, these meaty marvels earned a permanent spot on the medieval snack shelf. So there you have it. Dear snackers, more from the rough and ready medieval kitchen. From the soggy comfort of wine-drenched bread, to the sweet yet stubborn chew of dried fruits, to the sizzling bravery of blood pudding balls and lard-fried pancakes, this was a world of scraps turned into treasure, of flavors born out of hunger and hope. Stick around, because next up, we'll be diving deeper into the kitchens of medieval Europe, where recipes were born of necessity and every meal was a story. Hungry for more? Good, because this kitchen never closes. All right, medieval snack warriors, grab your tankards and sharpen your imaginations, because tonight we're cracking open another chapter of culinary chaos from a time when flavor was optional and survival was the only real seasoning. Picture this: pancakes you could stack like armor, chew like battle rations, and if you had leftovers, repurpose as building materials. Welcome to the deliciously unglamorous world of medieval flapjacks. You could eat these medieval pancakes, sweet, savory, or scorched into oblivion, depending on how distracted the cook was by local gossip. Leftovers, stack them up, call it cake, or slap them on your chest and declare yourself ready for a peasant joust. They were especially beloved during Lent or fasting days when meat was off the menu. Pancakes became the perfect culinary loophole. Fried, filling, and somehow both humble and indulgent, these rustic rounds were the medieval answer to, "I need carbs and I need them now." Let's not pretend they were pretty. These were pancakes that didn't need praise. All they required was a hot pan and a willing stomach, and they'd do the rest. Somewhere between a snack and a sacrament, they were the quiet champions of mealtime. Simple, satisfying, and always ready for whatever the cook threw at them, sometimes literally. But let's step away from these humble rounds of fried dough and wander into the realm of another curious snack, the medieval wafer. Thin, crisp, and suspiciously lightweight, these fragile biscuits walked the fine line between dessert and dental challenge. Wafers could be found everywhere outside churches, at village fairs, or nestled in the hands of monks who probably should have been focusing on prayer, not snacking. Sometimes they even bobbed in your soup like a little holy raft. Let's be clear, though these were no chocolate-dipped, cream-filled modern indulgences, medieval wafers were forged from little more than flour, water, and exif. You were feeling wild, maybe a dash of honey or rose water to impress the neighbors. They started as a thin batter, poured onto heavy iron wafer presses, and squeezed between two plates so hot they could singe your eyebrows. The result? A crispy disc that looked suspiciously like something from a communion plate and tasted like medieval ambition. Wafers were beloved for their portability and their lightning-fast turnaround. Street vendors would camp outside church doors on feast days, brandishing steaming stacks of wafers like sweet promises for the faithful. "Buy now, sin later" wasn't the official slogan, but you could feel the vibe. Some wafer irons had religious symbols or floral patterns etched into them, turning each wafer into a chewable work of art, though, let's be honest, those patterns didn't improve the flavor, just gave you something to stare at while you wondered why you were crunching through something that tasted like crispy air. Delicate and prone to cracking if you even looked at them sideways, wafers weren't exactly the sort of snack you could toss in a pack and forget. Eating them outdoors was a gamble-on gust of wind, and you'd be left with a lapful of crumbs and a whole lot of disappointment. Still, they were beloved. Light, crispy, and just fancy enough to let you feel like you were treating yourself without bankrupting your pantry or your teeth. For the fancy folks, wafers might be layered with fruit preserves or slathered with soft, cheese-little edible luxuries in a world where bread and onions were often the height of mealtime excitement. For everyone else, they were a quick bite on the go, a way to enjoy something sweetish without signing over your soul to the local baker. They might crumble under pressure, but wafers had an enduring charm, a medieval version of treat yourself, minus the whipped cream. But if wafers were the elegant flutter of medieval snacks, sucket was the decadent belly flop. Just hearing the name sucket sounds sticky, doesn't it? And sticky it was. Sucket was medieval fruit candy, fruit that had been boiled within an inch of its life, drowned in syrup, and locked away in glass jars like some sweet little hostage. Think candied orange peel, dates, or ginger slices, sugar-coated until they glowed like edible jewelry. These sugary delights weren't for your average plowhand chewing on his 10th onion of the week, oh no. Sucket was reserved for those with status and silver to spare. A sweet treat for the baron's feast table, a bribe for the bishop, or a wedding gift that said, "I like you, but I'm not giving you land." Sugar was expensive, fruit even more so. So sucket was the medieval flexa sign that you had trade routes, connections, and enough servants to keep stirring that sticky pot until your arms gave out. Making sucket was a labor of love and mild insanity. You'd start by boiling the fruit in thick syrup, maybe honey, maybe refined sugar, if your spice merchant owed you a favor. Then you'd drain it, let it dry, and do it again, and again. Because once was never enough. This was medieval candy, and it had to be worth the bragging rights. Eventually, you'd be left with glossy, jewel-toned cubes of fruit that could double as decoration and dessert in equal measure. Some versions stayed soft and syrupy, served in fancy glass jars at feasts. Others were dried out, rolled in more sugar, and handed out like sweet little cubes of medieval decadence. Whatever the form, succoth wasn't just food, it was a status symbol, a sugary promise that you'd arrived. After banquets, trays of succoth would make the rounds like edible gold coins. Guests would take one piece, smile politely, and immediately regret not grabbing 3 more. Meanwhile, commoners peeked from the kitchen, maybe licking a spoon if no one was watching. Was it worth the trouble? Oh, absolutely. Succoth was one of the few medieval treats that actually tasted like dessert and felt like luxury. And just when you think the medieval world can't surprise you anymore, along comes the showstopper of medieval junk food, fried eel. Yes, eel. A dish so bizarrely beloved it slithered from peasant stew pots to royal banquets without a second glance because, let's face it, everything was fair game when your main competition was boiled turnip soup. Eel was a medieval staple because it was cheap, plentiful, and, when fried, weirdly satisfying. Rivers and streams were full of them, and catching one was a midnight adventure. Imagine a slippery, writhing rope that didn't want to be dinner. Skinning it was a whole other dramaless, like preparing a fish, more like trying to wrangle a wet rope with teeth. But once you had it stripped and chopped, you seasoned it, if you were feeling fancy, and plunged it into bubbling fat. The result? Crispy, savory bites with a rich, slightly oily flavor like a cross between calamari and chicken having a midlife crisis in the tavern kitchen. Fried eel became the ultimate festival food, popping up at roadside stalls, fairgrounds, and even during religious fasts. That's right, because eel technically wasn't meat. It slipped through those pesky dietary loopholes like, well, itself. Monks nibbled on it in cloisters, nobles served it in pies to show off their kitchen's weird flexes, and kings crunched on it while plotting wars. Fried eel was a dish that didn't ask for your opinion, it just expected you to eat it and move on. And in a world where survival meant making the most of whatever the river offered up, fried eel was both a treat and a tiny rebellion against the dull monotony of medieval dining. So there you have it, noble, snackersa, fresh helping of medieval madness, from pancakes sturdy enough to double as armor to fish that fought back before they were fried. Stick around for the next chapter of this culinary adventure, because in the world of medieval snacking, the only real rule was, if it didn't kill you, it was probably dinner. All right, my curious snackers and sleepwalkers of history, strap in, because tonight's tale takes us from slippery serpents on medieval plates to the dream worlds of ancient empires where the line between dinner and divine messages was thinner than a medieval pancake. Let's kick it off with the final act of medieval munching, fried eel, that twisty, bone-laden monster that slithered from rivers straight into banquet halls without once stopping to wonder if it was actually invited. This was no polite guest. It was a slippery showstopper, paraded across feasting tables like it was auditioning for a role as the villain in a folktale you'd tell children to keep them from swimming after dark. Sure, eel had more bones than a bad relationship, and yes, it had a habit of wiggling even after its mortal coil had been shuffled off. But if you could stomach the mild horror of eating something that still looked like it might slither away, fried eel was downright delicious. Its skin would crisp up into a crackling golden jacket, the inside would be tender and flaky, and there'd be just enough grease to make you feel like you were flirting with disaster on a boring Wednesday afternoon. Nowadays, it might seem like an odd choice. Back then, it was considered a delicacy, a greasy, wiggly miracle that filled bellies and kept menus exciting in a world where excitement was usually reserved for jousts and plague outbreaks. But let's leap from the medieval kitchens of Europe to the ancient crossroads of mystery, Mesopotamia, where the dream world was as important as the waking one, and every vision in the night was a direct hotline to the gods. For the Sumerians, Akkadians, Assyrians, and Babylonians, a dream wasn't just a jumble of half-formed thoughts. It was a message, a divine telegram from the higher powers to your weary mortal mind. Ignoring a dream? That was like ghosting a deity in a world of vengeful gods and moody spirits. That was never a good idea. By around 2500 BCE, the Mesopotamians had codified their dream theories into entire libraries of clay tablets, etched with cuneiform script. These weren't bedtime stories, they were statecraft, medicine, and religion rolled into one. Kings would call off battles if their sleep showed a bad omen. Farmers would delay planting if their dreams had goats, doing things goats shouldn't. The world, they believed, was always talking to you. Was your job to pay attention while you snored. Professional dream interpreters, known as Baru priests, were the ancient version of Freudian analysts minus the couch, plus a whole lot of incense. These dream guides had access to vast libraries of omen texts, like the Ishkar Zaka, sort of cosmic cookbook that listed every possible dream scenario and its meaning. Eat dates in your dream? Great news, prosperity awaits. Teeth falling out? Buckle up, because death's making a house call. Having a dream about a goddess in, let's say, intimate circumstances? Either the gods are flirting, or you're in for a world of arrogant curses. These dream books didn't bother with guesswork every. Dream had a clear cause and a fated outcome. See a snake? Expect betrayal. Tumble from a rooftop? A lawsuit's brewing. It was logic just, not logic as we'd understand it. But they didn't stop at recording dreams. Mesopotamians practiced dream incubation too. Rulers would sleep in temples, fasting and burning incense, waiting for the gods to slip into their slumber with cryptic advice sometimes, cryptic enough to involve dancing goats. But who's to argue with divine dream grammar? For them, dreams weren't a puzzle to solve. They were a sacred realm to navigate with caution and reverence. And of course, with a handy library of clay tablets the size of your average donkey cart. Let's drift west to ancient Egypt, where dreams were not just nighttime curiosities, but sacred scripts played out in the theater of the mind. Egyptians believed dreams were messages from the gods, the spirits of ancestors, or even from the Kaith, spiritual double of a person that could wander while the body slept. Each dream, whether sweet or sinister, had intent. It might bless, it might warn, it might terrify, but it was never random. By the time of the New Kingdom, around 1550-1070 BCE, the Egyptians had compiled these nocturnal tales into some of history's earliest dream manuals. One of the most famous was the Ramesside Dream Book, unearthed centuries later in the village of Deir el-Medina. This was no light bedtime reading. It was a diagnostic tool, listing hundreds of dreams and pairing them with outcomes that ranged from the mundane to the miraculous. The logic was, let's say, flexible. If a man dreamed of eating crocodile meat, apparently that meant he'd become a high official because in Egyptian cosmology, crocodiles were tied to Sobek, a god of strength and power. Munching on a crocodile in your dream, that was your soul trying to tell you it was time to climb the social ladder. Every entry in this dream book started with, "If a man sees himself," followed by the dream and its meaning, drawn from centuries of temple lore and ritual tradition. These interpretations weren't mere guesses, they were accepted truths, color-coded in red and black ink to mark whether the dream was good news or a bad omen that called for some serious spiritual damage control. If you ended up with a bad dream, you didn't just shrug it off. You'd head to the nearest temple, light some incense, and beg the local priest to run spiritual interference. Many of these priests, especially those devoted to healing gods like Serket or Thoth, offered dream incubation services. Supplicants would sleep inside the temple itself, hoping for a healing dream to guide them or a vision to quiet the troubles in their mind. This wasn't just folklore, it was part of ancient healthcare, a fusion of magic, medicine, and spiritual counseling that turned every night's sleep into a chance for transformation. Dreams influenced everything from amulet prescriptions to rituals meant to erase a nightmare from memory, like hitting the undo button on a cosmic scale. For the Egyptians, the sleeping mind wasn't resting. It was busy hosting a parade of gods, demons, and ancestral spirits on otherworldly stage where truth and terror danced together, and where every vision might be the key to understanding the deeper mysteries of life, or at least surviving it. Now let's hop over to ancient Greece, where dreams were more than divine hints, they were clinical appointments with the gods. At the heart of this belief was incubation, a ritual that had little to do with poultry and everything to do with spiritual healing. The Greeks didn't just want to sleep, they wanted to sleep with purpose. Leading this cosmic health clinic was Asclepios, the god of medicine. His temples, called Asclepia, spread across the land from Epidaurus to Pergamon, each a sanctuary for the sick and the hopeful. The process wasn't simple. Before you could even lie down on the stone beds of the temple's inner sanctum, you had to purify yourself, bathe, fast, maybe sacrifice a goat if the priest was in a particularly strict mood. Only then could you close your eyes and hope that divine medicine would come calling. According to ancient inscriptions and the battered testimonies of those who wandered these sacred halls, some patients dreamed of Asclepios himself, staff in hand, tapping them into wellness. Others dreamed of snakeshes, sacred creatures slithering over their bodies in the dark, a sign that healing was on the way. Whether the dreams were real, psychosomatic, or driven by a very convincing placebo effect, the results were profound. Even the father of modern medicine, Hippocrates himself, tipped his hat to the power of dreams in healing. So, what have we learned from these slippery eels and whispering gods? That from medieval Europe to ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt and beyond, food and dreams weren't just about filling bellies and passing nights. They were rituals, adventures, and the secret language of survival in a world where every bite and every dream was a chance to bargain with fate. Stick around. Dreamers and diners, there's always more to taste and more to hear in the echoes of the ancient kitchens and sleeping minds of the world. All right, dreamers and scholars of ancient mysteries, lean in, because tonight we're crossing the threshold from medieval meals to the moonlit world of ancient prophecies, where dreams were never just random flickers of the mind, but divine maps to be read, revered, and sometimes feared. In those storied lands of Greece, Mesopotamia, and Egypt, dreams weren't cast off as bedtime nonsense. Far from it, these ancient peoples believed dreams revealed the very state of the body and soul. In the dusty chambers of Hippocratic medicine, dreams were diagnostic tools. If you dreamed of water flowing, your kidneys were trying to tell you something. If you dreamed of your chest being crushed, well, you might want to check if you could still breathe. Ancient healers saw dreams as windows to the body's secrets, hinting at ailments and offering clues for healing. In Hippocratic writings, dreams fell into two categories, natural and divine. Natural dreams came from your diet, your digestion, your stress after fighting with your neighbor over that goat. But divine dreams, those were entirely different messages, not from your belly but from the stars themselves. Not every interpreter wore flowing robes and carried scrolls. In crowded marketplaces and smoky taverns, the true stars of the night were the dream reader Critimen, and women who turned the chaos of dreams into oracles of fate. With a flick of the hand and a heavy dose of showmanship, they'd consult battered manuals and arcane symbols, offering cryptic advice or thrilling prophecy. The most famous of these guides was the Oneirocritica, written by Artemidorus of Daldis in the 2nd century CE book that turned dream reading into an art, a science, and a performance that would echo through centuries. For the Greeks, dreams weren't just sleep's passing fancy. They were the shimmering bridge between mortal lives and divine design, a place where your body's quiet whispers and the cosmos' booming voice could meet. In the best of cases, you'd wake with a cure in your hands and maybe a snake curled around your feet, the ultimate sign that the gods had listened. But if there was one kind of dream that stood above all others in the ancient mind, it was the prophetic dream. These weren't casual messages. They were potent glimpses of destiny, direct communiques from forces far beyond mortal reach. Across Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and beyond, prophetic dreams were sacred transmissions, divine news flashes that could change the course of a kingdom or the fate of a farmer's fields. In the ancient Hebrew world, prophetic dreams were well known and widely respected. The Old Testament is woven through with dream-fueled visions. Joseph, the dreamer of dreamers, saw sheaves of wheat bowing to him, a symbol of future power that would catapult him from slave to strategist. Later, as an interpreter in the Egyptian court, he read Pharaoh's dreams of fat cows and thin cows as a cosmic warning of feast and famine, altering the future of an empire with nothing but the power of sleep. The Assyrian king Ashurbanipal claimed he saw the gods themselves in his dreams, guiding him to military triumph and political cunning. For these ancient rulers, a prophetic dream was the final stamp of divine legitimacy, a glowing seal that said, "Yes, you are meant to rule, and woe to those who doubted." In Greece, dreams were sorted into categories synhypnia, dreams from the restless mind, and oneiroi alethanoi, the true dreams, those visions that peeled back the curtain of reality and offered real truths. Leaders wouldn't dare launch a campaign or found a city without first checking the night's visions, because in a world where every shadow had a spirit, ignoring a dream's warning was the ultimate folly. The Greeks believed dreams had their own minor gods, the oneiroi, winged spirits who slipped through the crack of sleep to deliver cryptic messages from the other side. Even the famously practical Romans took dreams seriously. Emperor Augustus claimed to have dreamed his future glories into being, while the less fortunate Nero dabbled in dream readings with mixed results. Perhaps if he'd listened a little more closely, history would have been kinder. General Scipio Africanus, the man who outfoxed Hannibal, dreamed of victory before it became reality proof that in the Roman world, the path to glory could begin in sleep. Prophetic dreams weren't mere bedtime curiosities. They were the kingdom's secret advisors, tools of power, and badges of divine favor. In these ancient cultures, the fates of empires and the rise of legends could hinge on a fleeting nighttime whisper. And though Greek temples like those of Asclepios are the best-known havens for dream healing, they were not alone in this mystical practice. In the rugged lands of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey dream incubation flourished in a mesmerizing swirl of Hittite, Phrygian, and Greco-Roman traditions. Here, temples rose from hilltops, perched to catch the soft glow of the moon-like antennas tuned to the lunar gods. The most captivating of these was the cult of Men, the Phrygian lunar god, a figure as fluid and mysterious as the dreams he inspired. His shrines were built under the open sky, as if to invite the moon's silver whispers directly into the hearts of sleeping pilgrims. These sites weren't just places to rest, they were sanctuaries for the weary and the worried, where dreams were doors to healing and truth. Worshippers would wind through labyrinthine paths carved into the earth, their steps tracing sacred geometry, meant to focus the mind and align the soul with the divine frequency. Soft music drifted through these moonlit halls, mingling with the scent of incense and the hushed chant of priests. Here, sleep was no mere rest, it was an intentional, sacred act of reaching out to the cosmos and daring it to answer. Dream priests, keepers of these lunar sanctuaries, guided supplicants through this nocturnal journey. They might even seed a dream, slipping a carved idol beneath your pillow or whispering cryptic symbols before sleep, steering your visions like a helmsman guiding a ship through the night. Dream of a lion? A brave son was on the way. Dream of rain? A daughter blessed with growth and wisdom. These visions weren't just for entertainment, they were the answers to life's most pressing riddles. Even royalty wasn't above seeking answers in dreams. Hittite records are filled with kings and queens who received messages in sleep, strategic advice, promises of healing, or the occasional sharp divine rebuke to keep them humble. These dreams shaped policies and fates, weaving the mortal and the divine into a single, restless tapestry. So there you have, across empires and ages, from the sizzle of fried eel in a medieval kitchen to the shadowed sanctuaries of Anatolia's moonlit hills, the ancient world knew that sleep was never just sleep. It was a battleground, a chapel, and a council hall where every bite of eel and every sigh in your dreams might shape the world to come. Stick around, because the next chapter in this timeless saga is just around the corner. More mysteries, more flavors, and more glimpses into the echoing halls of the past, where even the dead of night held secrets worth chasing. All right, Dreamers and seekers of ancient whispers, let's slip once more into the shadowy world where sleep wasn't just rest, but an open door to gods, fate, and maybe your deepest fears. Welcome to a world where a queen's destiny could shift on a single whispered vision. And dreams weren't personal, they were political, cosmic, and dangerously real. Picture this. In the hilltop shrines of ancient Anatolia, where moonlight caught every stone like a blessing, a queen once dreamed she should adopt a foreign goddess into her temple. It wasn't just a personal signet, it was an early act of divine diplomacy. In those Anatolian nights, dream incubation wasn't just an individual ritual, it was a communal practice, a cosmic negotiation. Pilgrims came from every dusty road, forming temporary communities, bound not by blood, but by the shared vulnerability of dreams and the desperate hope that sleep might reset the tangled knots of their lives. To dream in Anatolia wasn't passive, was an active ritual of participation. Healing, prophecy, and even alliances flowed not from debate, but from the silent grammar of sleep. By the 12th century CE, this ancient practice had evolved into a disciplined craft, and no one embodied that craft more than a Greek mind with an Anatolian heart, Artemidorus of Daldis. Artemidorus didn't just believe in dreams, she cataloged them, dissected them, turned them into a map of the ancient soul. His work, the Oneirocritica, was no flimsy scroll of mystical mumbo-jumbo. It was a 5-book opus, written in precise Greek, that captured thousands of dreams and their meanings, drawn from interviews with sailors, merchants, soldiers, even prostitutes. His theory? If you want to understand a culture's soul, start with the dreams it dares to share. He sorted dreams like a scholar, with a poet's curiosity actions, animals, professions, bodily functions, tangled relationships. Dreams of flying might mean freedom or arrogance. Naked in public? For a noble, it might suggest hidden power. For a laborer, only shame. Teeth falling out? That one stuck with us, even today. Loss, plain and brutal. What set Artemidorus apart was his insistence that context mattered. Earlier dream books handed down static meanings like recipes. Artemidorus recognized that the same dream shifted shape based on the dreamer's social standing, gender, and daily struggles. A shipwreck for a rich merchant might spell financial ruin. For a poor man, it might be the start of new fortune. It was, in a way, the first spark of something like psychotherapy, tailored, dynamic, and deeply personal. He also waded headlong into the murky waters of symbolism. A dream of dying didn't necessarily mean death. It might herald a fresh start. A dream of sex wasn't always desire, it could be power, fear, guilt. Artemidorus walked that fine line where logic danced with the absurd, crafting a system that was half ancient science, half shimmering poetry. His Oneirocritica didn't vanish with the fall of temples and empires. It echoed through the Roman Empire and the Byzantine world, shaping how medieval monks and Arabic scholars read the mind's secret language. Artemidorus didn't claim dreams were messages from the gods, but he believed they rose from somewhere deep, strange, and worth decoding. Yet not every dream in the ancient world was a gift from the divine. Some were unwelcome visitors, nightmares that clung like cold breath and whispered of darker things. These dreams weren't seen as random terrors of the night. They were warnings, punishments, omens that demanded action. The Babylonians were some of the first to draw that chilling line. If a dream left you shaken, ill, or haunted, it was considered tainted, a sign that a malevolent force was at play. A dream of being chased by a demon might prompt the interpreter to recommend protective amulets, or the burning of cedar incense to drive the darkness away. Nightmares were spiritual threats, demanding immediate countermeasures, rituals to cleanse, to soothe, to banish. The Egyptians, masters of cosmic balance, also saw nightmares as spiritual skirmishes. Malicious spirits, including the restless dead, were believed to slip through the veil of sleep to torment the unwary. To guard against these nocturnal assaults, amulets bearing the protective eye of Horus were worn, or images of the dwarf god Bez, champion of households and midnight warriors. Some even recited dream-erasing spells upon waking, treating nightmares like contagious curses that had to be spoken away before they took root in the waking world. For the Greeks, nightmares often carried a message not from the bright halls of Olympus, but from the shadowed underworld. Chthonic deities Hades, Persephone, the relentless furies might visit in sleep to warn, accuse, or hint at crimes that still hung in the air like smoke. Ignoring these dark visitations wasn't an option. Even Plato, in the Republic, wrote of the dream as a battlefield between reason and appetite. Nightmares were not just spiritual omens, but psychological alarms, signs that your inner self was out of balance. The ever-practical Romans, too, were not immune to the shiver of the nightmare. Dreams of owls, snakes, or wolves were enough to send shudders down the spine of even the most hardened legionnaire. Such dreams signaled death, betrayal, or war on the horizon, warnings not to be ignored. And they believed the dead could visit the living through dreams, to accuse, to beg, or to warn of looming tragedy. Everywhere, in every temple, and on every windswept hill, dreams were more than personal echoes. They were cosmic red flags, flashing in the night to remind the sleeper that the world was far larger and far stranger than the quiet darkness of their bed. To dream was to glimpse that endless world, to stand at the edge of the known and feel the breath of the unknown on your skin. So there you have it, night travelers. Whether it was a queen's vision in an Anatolian shrine or a peasant's nightmare beneath a sodden thatch roof, dreams were the pulse of the ancient world. They were sacred, communal, and as tangled and beautiful as the star-strewn skies those dreamers slept beneath. And next time you close your eyes, remember, in the ancient world, sleep was never just sleep. It was a secret theater, a council of gods, and a whisper of the vast and eternal. Stick around, our next chapter promises more midnight mysteries and daytime curiosities, because in this endless dance of food, fate, and fear, every night holds another tale worth dreaming. All right, my curious dreamers, gather round, because tonight we're pulling back the veil on the final act of the ancient sleep saga, where visions weren't just bedtime riddles. They were political weapons, cosmic cables, and the secret currency of power. In a world that believed everything was connected, even the silent flickers of a dream carried weight. There was no true escape from fate. Even sleep was no sanctuary. Dreams weren't just spiritual meanderings. They were political dynamite, tools wielded by priests, generals, and kings to bend the world to their will. When the gods spoke in sleep, those in power wasted no time claiming, "They spoke to me and me alone." Take Alexander the Great, for instance, a conqueror with an eye for omens. Before his armies thundered into Egypt, he reportedly dreamed of the ram-horned god Ammon, welcoming him as a son. Upon reaching the Sewa oasis, the oracle confirmed it, declaring Alexander a divine offspring. Was it real? A script rehearsed in secret? It didn't matter. The dream sealed his image as more than mortal, a living god who carried not just a sword, but the voice of the heavens. Dreams were never more valuable than during uncertain times. In Rome, Augustus claimed he dreamed of his great victory at Actium, where he crushed Mark Antony and Cleopatra in a battle that rewrote the empire's future. That dream was soon minted in poetry, etched into coins, and wrapped in the silk of state propaganda. Later emperors followed suit. After all, if the gods were on your side, who could stand against you? Priests and oracles, keepers of these slippery truths, leaned in too. Dream interpretation was a theological tool, especially when it helped keep the powerful secure on their thrones. A rebellious governor dreaming of ruin, the priest would declare it divine punishment, an easy way to keep the governor's ambitions in check. Conversely, dreams of ripe fields and easy victory could embolden a king to raise taxes, launch a campaign, or pass sweeping reforms. This wasn't just a man's world, either. Queen Hatshepsut of Egypt wrote in temple carvings that her birth had been foretold by the god Amun, appearing to her mother in sleep. In a throne room dominated by men, dreams gave her reign divine, legitimate, etched, not in ink, but in prophecy. Elsewhere, prophets of the Hebrew Bible used dreams to challenge the arrogance of kings. Daniel interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's towering dream statue, prophesying the rise and fall of empires like a cosmic chessboard. In those hands, dreams weren't just personal, they were the soul of geopolitics. Everywhere, dreams allowed rulers to say, "This is not merely my will, it is the will of the cosmos." Whether truly divine or crafted as celestial theater, dreams were potent currency, turning the restless mind into an empire's secret advisor. And though the temples of dreamers now sleep under layers of dust, their legacy lingers. Even today, the fascination with symbols, recurring motifs, and those unshakable nightmares has roots in those ancient libraries and firelit shrines. The medieval world inherited these traditions wholesale, binding them to new faiths and fresh dogmas. In the Islamic Golden Age, scholars translated Artemidorus's Onera Critica into Arabic, expanding on it and weaving it into Islamic mysticism, where dreams were keys to divine knowledge. In the Christian world, monks and theologians cataloged the dreams of saints and martyrs, visions that foretold miracles or warned of divine judgment to come. The structure remained the same: sleep as a window to the sacred, dreams as cryptic messages, and interpreters as the bridges between the mortal world and something grander. Fast forward to the 19th century, and you meet Sigmund Freud, a man who, though he stripped dreams of religious gloss, borrowed heavily from the symbolic playbook written centuries before. In his 1899 interpretation of dreams, Freud argued that dreams expressed repressed fears and secret longings. But he still leaned on ancient tools: metaphor, symbol, and narrative. His student, Carl Jung, carried the torch even further, seeing dreams as a realm of archetypes, universal figures like the hero, the shadow, and the wise elder. Echoes of Greek temples and Babylonian omen lists whispered through their work. Modern neuroscience has taken the dream apart, tracing it in REM sleep and neural pulses, seeing how trauma, memory, and emotion shape those flickering midnight scenes. And yet, beneath the clinical data, ancient ideas endure. Dreams are never random. They mirror the body's health, the mind's quiet storms, and the soul's hidden chambers. Pop culture still fans the ancient flames horror films that haunt us with sleep paralysis, demons, self-help apps that promise self-discovery through dream journals, and tarot cards that echo the old priest's cryptic predictions. Even now, we can't shake the sense that the night carries messages worth decoding. Because in the end, the ancients knew a truth we're still chasing. Dreams are not empty flickers of the mind. They are stories, warnings, blessings, or burdens whispered in the dark in the language of gods, ancestors, and our own secret selves. And across time, the question remains the same: what is your dream trying to tell you? But before you can answer, let's pivot. Because while dreams whispered in temples, a new kind of ambition was taking shape in a world of telegraphs and railroads, in a young country racing westward like a comet. The year was 1860. The United States was stretched taut, from bustling eastern cities to the rugged expanse of California, now a state in name, but still a distant cousin in practice. The East buzzed with industry and iron rails. The West lingered in the fog of its own myths, connected to the rest of the country only by the slow, treacherous veins of the mail. A letter from New York to San Francisco? 3, maybe 4 weeks, if the weather was kind, the seas gentle, and the outlaws sleepy. The usual route snaked down the Atlantic, crept across Panama's feverish jungles, and then clawed up the Pacific coast, a journey riddled with delays, diseases, and more than a few sharp knives. Overland mail was no better. Stagecoaches slogged through mud, snow, and bandit ambushes, inching west like stubborn mules. These delays weren't just inconveniences, they were political worries. In an age when the word secession was more than just talk, keeping California tethered to the Union wasn't a matter of convenience, it was a national emergency. Enter a new breed of visionary. Entrepreneurs, politicians, and wild-eyed dreamers began to hatch plans as bold as they were mad schemes to stitch the far-flung edges of the country together with the only resource they had in endless supply: open space. And in that wide, empty space, they'd soon lay the tracks for one of the greatest legends of the American West. Stick around, because the next chapter isn't just about dream sits, about the brave and the bold, the fast and the fearless, and the race to turn an idea into a galloping reality. All right, saddle up and hold tight because tonight we're galloping headlong into the wild heart of America's frontier dreams. In a world of endless land and restless ambition, one question echoed across the dusty plains. What if fast horses and fearless riders could shrink the continent, turning weeks of waiting into just 10 days of thundering hoofbeats? It was an audacious idea, one born out of desperation, frontier bravado, and the eternal promise of the open road. The plan was as simple as it was insane. Build a relay of stations across nearly 20 miles linking St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California. Riders would swap out fresh mounts at stations every 10 to 15 miles, galloping like ghosts in the night. If it worked, they'd shave weeks off delivery times, bridging oceans, mountains, and every unpredictable patch of this rugged continent. Of course, the route itself was no gentle country ride. It snaked across mountain ranges, deserts that drank sweat like water, icy rivers that could swallow a man whole, and territories so new they barely had names. Riders faced blistering sun, freezing nights, and the constant, very real threat of ambush. But if they pulled it off, this would be the fastest line of communication the nation had ever seen. A miracle, stitched together with horseshoes and saddle leather. The challenge was clear. America was racing westward, expanding faster than its roads and rails could keep up. And so, driven by a mix of panic and pure frontier audacity, a daring solution was born, one saddlebag at a time. The Pony Express was about to make history. This legendary relay wasn't conjured out of thin air. It was the brainchild of three gritty entrepreneurs from Missouri's freight world: William H. Russell, Alexander Major, and William B. Waddell. Veterans of hauling goods and government supplies across the roughest trails in the West, these three saw a chance to transform mail delivery into a race against time itself. For Russell, the stakes were personal. With his name tarnished by scandals and half-failed ventures, he saw the Pony Express as redemption on horseback, a way to silence his critics and win back government favor. Major, the devout and iron-willed planner, brought military precision to the project, demanding discipline and even requiring his riders and station masters to swear oaths against drink and foul language, small feat in a land where whiskey was practically currency. Waddell, the quietest of the trio, was the steady hand on the purse strings. While Russell dreamed big and Major drew up maps that read like battle plans, Waddell kept the books and made sure the money didn't vanish faster than a prairie breeze. Together, these three men threw everything they had into the venture. They bought over 400 horses, hired more than 80 lean, wiry riders, and built a chain of roughly 190 relay stations that cut a crooked line across some of the most unforgiving landscapes in North America. They knew it was a gamble: no government funding, no safety net, and no promise of success. But in those early days of American expansion, boldness was its own kind of prayer. In April 1860, they let the horses fly. The Pony Express was no longer an idea, it was a living, breathing race against the clock. This wasn't just about mail, it was a fragile bridge of muscle and speed, built across the great, unmapped sweep of a young nation. Building that bridge was a feat of endurance and stubbornness. The full route spanned nearly 20 miles, cutting through rolling plains, jagged mountain ranges, blistering deserts, and rivers that had claimed more than a few unlucky travelers. Every 10 to 15 miles, a relay station waited, ready to swap out horses and keep the line moving at a gallop. These stations were a mixed bag, some little more than sod huts where a single lantern flickered in the night, others fortified outposts ringed with rough fences and bristling with wary station masters. Every 75 to 100 miles, larger home stations offered battered cots, a hot meal, and a moment's peace for the riders before they were back in the saddle, racing the sun. The real stars, though, were the horse, over 400 of them, chosen for their sheer, heart-pounding speed and iron-boned stamina. In the east, sleek thoroughbreds took the stage, their hooves thundering across the open prairie. In the rugged West, it was the Mustangs who ruled, compact, tough as old boots, and as quick to fight as they were to run. These were the Ferraris of the frontier, each one a streak of muscle and spirit. The riders themselves were chosen for their youth, their fearlessness, and let's face it, their willingness to risk life and limb for a handful of coins and a legend. They'd thunder into a station, leap off a sweat-slick horse mid-stride, and vault onto a fresh mount in seconds, as if the very air behind them was on fire. There was no time to waste. A moment's delay could mean a letter's death sentence, a family's heartbreak, or the collapse of an empire's fragile dream. Every mile of the Pony Express was a gamble against nature's worst moods. Heat that turned rivers to dust, nights so cold the world itself seemed to crack, and always the threat of outlaws or hostile riders lurking in the sagebrush. Yet still, the relay station stood firm, horse and hope bound together in a race no one else dared to run. The founders knew they were courting disaster as much as glory. Yet for Russell, Major, and Waddell, this wasn't just about mail contracts and gold coins. It was a testament to American grit, a declaration that in a world of sprawling horizons, no distance was too far and no obstacle too high if you had the courage to ride straight at it. And so the Pony Express was born, galloping into the history books with a crack of leather and a prayer for safe passage. No government funding, no iron rails, just raw determination and the beating hearts of riders and horses who refused to let the dream die. The next chapter in this galloping saga, how these men and their iron-nerved riders faced down storms, mountains, and more than a few unfriendly stares to keep the line alive. Because in the wild swirl of America's expansion, every hoofbeat counted. Stick around, because the story of the Pony Express is only just getting started. All right, saddle up for the next chapter of this unstoppable ride, because tonight we're diving into the gritty details of how the Pony Express didn't just race across America's wild frontier. It fought tooth and nail to keep the dream alive against everything nature and man could throw at it. To keep this daring operation running, an army of quiet heroes stood ready. Station keepers with rifles, enough feed to keep horses thundering, and water stashed in dusty barrels. All of it had to be hauled in advance. It took months of planning and brutal labor to keep those 190 outposts stocked and manned. These weren't bustling outposts of comfort, they were lonely beacons in some of the most remote, punishing landscapes in North America. The weather was the first and fiercest foe. Riders would face blizzards in the Sierra Nevada, sandstorms swirling like phantoms in the Utah desert, and searing sun that cracked the Nebraska plains into a maze of dust. Collapsing trails, swollen rivers, and wolves in the darkness, these were the daily dangers they faced. And then, of course, there were the human threats. Bandits with loaded pistols, the simmering tensions with Native American tribes, and the outlaws lurking like ghosts along the shadowy trails. Yet even with these dangers, the system worked. Riders changed every 75 to 100 miles, horses swapped every 10 to 15, and that precious mail flew across the continent at a speed no one thought possible. In a land where every mile had once meant isolation, the Pony Express stitched together a fragile thread of connection on hoofbeat at a time. April 3rd, 1860, the day it all thundered to life. In St. Joseph, Missouri, a restless crowd gathered outside the Pikes Peak stables. They were there to see history gallop out of the dust. The inaugural rider, most likely Johnny Fry though, the record is as dusty as the trails mounted his horse, took the leather mochila crammed with letters and newspapers and bolted westward like he was outrunning the future itself. The crowd roared, cannons boomed, and with that, a new chapter of American history cracked open like a thunderclap. The mail pouch Fry carried weighed a humble 20 pounds, but it was more than paper and ink. It was a promise. A telegraph message had already been sent from Washington, D.C., and now it was time for horses and riders to close the last wild gap between East and West. At the same moment, another rider in Sacramento was galloping east, his mission the mirror image of Fry's. Between them stretched nearly 20 miles of wilderness river crossings that swallowed wagons whole, deserts that cooked men alive, and forests that whispered in the night. Their goal? 10 days, no more. 10 days to prove that the wild edges of the nation could be drawn together with sweat, speed, and the relentless pounding of hooves. Each rider on the Pony Express route carried the mochila, small leather saddle cover with 4 locked pouches that could be slipped over the saddle horn in seconds. Speed was everything. No unbuckling, no fuss. Just swap, vault, and ride like hell. Riders were expected to keep up a pace of 10 miles an hour, even in the pitch-black night or the icy bite of a blizzard. And they did it. Against all odds, that first ride reached Sacramento in 9 days, and 23 hours saw near miracle of grit and horseflesh. Newspapers hailed it as a triumph of modern communication. In that moment, the Pony Express became more than a mail service. It became a symbol of possibility, a flash of hope that even the vast, fractured West could be connected by sheer determination. For the nation, it was a taste of something new, communication at speeds that felt almost magical. For the riders, it was the start of a dangerous, thrilling chapter. The Pony Express had proven that distance was no match for courage and cunning. The true lifeblood of this fragile miracle? It wasn't the horses or the carefully placed stations. It was the riders themselves, a ragtag band of teenage daredevils who faced weather, wolves, and war to deliver the mail. They weren't just couriers. They were legends in the making, American myth in motion. The typical rider was barely 18, often closer to 16. They had to be wiry, quick, and weigh no more than 125 pounds. The famous recruitment had probably more tall-tale than fact allegedly read, "Wanted, young, skinny, wiry fellows not over 18. Must be expert riders willing to risk death daily. Orphans preferred." True or not, it captured the wild spirit of the job. These boys rode 75 to 100 miles a shift, changing horses at every station but never stopping to rest until they'd handed off the mochila to the next boy. They rode through pitch-black nights and bone-soaking rain, through snow that buried the land and sun that blistered it. Each carried a revolver or a rifle, but they knew speed was their only real armor. Many rode unarmed, trusting only in the power of their galloping escape. Some of these boys became legends in their own right. Pony Bob Haslam, for example, once rode nearly 380 miles in under 2 days during a violent uprising shot with arrows, but determined to finish his run. William Buffalo Bill Cody, who would later become a Wild West showman, claimed he rode for the Pony Express at 15, though historians still argue about that one. Still, the real stories were dramatic enough. Riders had to navigate the Rockies, cross the Great Basin, and gamble their lives every time they touched the saddle. And somehow, they kept the mail moving, even in the face of storms, violence, and the endless unknown. Only one mochila was ever lost in the entire history of the Pony Express. Riders earned between $100 and $150 a month to make them rich by frontier standards. But they didn't just ride for the money. They rode for the thrill, for the wild hope of the race, and because every gallop stitched the continent closer together. These boys were more than messengers. They were avatars of American courage, symbols of the raw tenacity that said no mountain was too high and no desert too wide. For 18 unforgettable months, they proved that even in the wildest corner of the world, connection was possible if you had the will and the guts to chase it. Riding for the Pony Express wasn't just a job, it was a daily wager against death, a mission that demanded everything a boy could give, and more. They braved storms that could freeze your bones and rivers that could swallow you whole. They faced down bandits who saw their mail pouches as treasure chests, and they knew that even a moment's hesitation could end in disaster. And still they rode on. Because in a country racing to define itself, in a wilderness where every mile was a challenge, these young riders proved that the human spirit was tougher than any mountain pass, faster than any chasing wolf, and more determined than any outlaw's bullet. Stick around, because next we'll ride even deeper into the stories of these daring couriers and the frontier world they galloped through, mile after mile, until the dream became legend. All right, hold your breath and steel your nerves, because tonight we're plunging into the final, breathtaking chapter of the Pony Express, where every gallop was a dance with death, and every letter carried the weight of a country's hopes. These riders, these half-grown legends in leather and grit, rode alone for hours at a time, with nothing but their horse, their weapon, and the black, endless night to keep them company. A broken leg, an injured horse, or a missed station could mean dying alone in the wilderness, swallowed by snowdrifts or lost forever to the desert winds. Yet they rode on, fearless and defiant. In that constant duel with danger, the system held. Mail was delayed, sure, but almost never lost. Riders were sometimes wounded, but more often than not, they rode through hail and hell to make their deliveries. In 18 months of operation, only a handful of men were killed, on the job proof that even the deadliest landscapes could be conquered, if only for long enough to deliver a scrap of paper and a scrap of hope. The Pony Express wasn't some Wild West daydream. It was real, raw, and often terrifying. But in that crucible of dust and danger, the riders became living legends, proving that even the most brutal terrain could be tamed by sheer human will, if only for the briefest flash of time. For all its brevity, the Pony Express carved a lasting mark. In a nation tearing at the seams with the approach of civil war, the Express offered proof that distance was no longer destiny. Before those young riders took the saddle, a letter from New York to San Francisco might arrive weeks too late to matter. Political orders lost, business deals crumbled, personal news turned to heartbreak. But with the Express, a letter could reach the Golden Hills of California in just 10 days. Suddenly, the West was no longer some far-off dream. It was part of the same breath, the same pulse as the East. Businesses grew bold, newspapers reported nearly in real time, and families felt their bonds tighten across the endless plains. Most importantly, the Union felt that much closer, an invisible thread pulled tight at the exact moment when the country most needed to remember it was one. Politically, the Express was a symbol proof to Washington that the West was more than a distant echo. President James Buchanan, in those final tense months before Lincoln's election, read dispatches from California made possible by the Express and drew a breath of relief that the West was still listening. Economically, those stations cut into the wilderness like seeds for the future. The relay posts became natural markers for the railroads and telegraph lines that would soon web the continent. What was once a mad gamble became the blueprint for how America would link itself from sea to shining sea. Culturally, the Express became something bigger than the sum of its galloping parts. Newspapers turned the riders into folk heroes overnight. Young boys in eastern towns dreamed of the day they might ride like thunder across the plains, a leather mail pouch across their back, and destiny in their hands. The Express didn't just connect America, it captured its restless heart. Even after the last horse had galloped out of the history books, the legend of the Pony Express only grew brighter. It became a symbol of speed, courage, and the relentless spirit that turned the empty frontier into a land of possibility. In just over a year, the Pony Express did what no steamship or political treaty could. It made America feel like one country, beating with a single heart. For all its daring, the Pony Express was doomed from the start. Not because it failed, no. It was too bold, too brilliant to fail, but because the world was changing faster than even the swiftest horse. Just 2 days after that first ride in April, 1,860 workers were already stringing telegraph wire across the prairie. The transcontinental telegraph advanced mile by mile, its silent click-clack spelling the end of the galloping age. On October 24th, 1,861, barely 18 months after the first rider took the reins, the final wire was strung across the continent. The message it carried crossed in minutes what had once taken weeks. The Pony Express carried its last letter that very day. The silence of hoofbeats was replaced by the staccato hum of Morse code, and with it, the promise of a new kind of connection. But truth be told, the Pony Express was already bleeding money by then. Even as its riders became legends, Russell, Majors, and Waddell, those bold architects of the impossible, were sinking under the weight of their own daring. They had poured over 700 into the venture and recouped barely a fraction. Without government backing, and with the relentless costs of horses, feed, and desperate logistics, The Express was a financial dreamer's folly. It had always been more than a business. It was a proof of concept, a defiant declaration that no mountain or desert could cage human ingenuity. And so, even as the last rider dismounted, there was no bitterness in the end. The Express had done exactly what it set out to do: show the world that speed and courage could conquer distance. Riders took new jobs. Stations became homes, barns, or ruins swallowed by prairie grass. The country turned its gaze to the crackling telegraph wire sand beyond them, to the railroads and the endless horizon. The Pony Express had been a torch now. It was time to pass it on. But for one brief, roaring moment, the Pony Express was everything. In an age obsessed with speed, these teenage boys and their sweat-soaked horses proved that even in the wildest corners of the world, the future could be reached on thunderous gallop at a time. Though it lasted just 18 months, the Pony Express galloped straight into the soul of America, where it remains today, a myth, a memory, and a reminder that even in the hardest times, there are still those willing to ride into the unknown. Next up, how these mythic hoofbeats echo even now in films, books, and the lingering breath of history. Because the Pony Express didn't just connect a nation, it showed us that courage rides faster than any wire ever could. All right, gather round for the final stretch of this galloping tale where the legend of the Pony Express didn't fade with the last hoofbeat, but thundered on into the American imagination, carving itself into stone, story, and song. It didn't take long for schoolbooks and campfire stories to transform the Pony Express from a hard-nosed mail service into an icon of frontier mythology. The image of a lone rider, silhouetted against the sunset leather mochila slung across his back, six-shooter at his hip, the wind singing in his ears, captured the national soul. It was more than nostalgia. It was a story that told Americans who they wanted to be. At a time when the nation was still raw and restless, the Express offered a story of courage and unity forged in the saddle. Names like Pony, Bob Haslam, and Buffalo Bill Cody galloped into the limelight. Whether or not Cody really rode for the Express hardly mattered. He wrapped himself in the legend, turning it into a Wild West spectacle that crossed oceans and crowned him showman royalty. In Cody's Wild West shows, the Pony Express rider became a symbol of unstoppable youth and wild-eyed daring, immortalized in the minds of millions. Monuments soon rose along the dusty trails. They once rode statues of riders frozen in mid-gallop, capturing that fleeting moment when man and horse were one against the wilderness. Today, from St. Joseph to Sacramento, highways, bike paths, and roadside markers trace the ghost of that original trail. Reenactments, museums, and weathered plaques keep the memory alive, while the U.S. Postal Service has paid tribute with stamps that still carry the whisper of galloping hooves. But the legend endures for reasons far deeper than bronze statues or vintage postage. The Pony Express is a window into a time when communication wasn't instant, it was a test of will and endurance. A time when messages had to be wrested from the wilderness, carried not by satellite but by sheer human determination. It's a reminder that connection wasn't always a tap on a screen, but a race through snow, dust, and the long hush of night. In our era of Wi-Fi and fiber optics, it's easy to forget how hard it once was to stitch a country together. The Pony Express stands as a tribute to those who bridged impossible distances not with wires, but with sweat and muscle and the pounding heartbeat of a horse at full gallop. Its legend doesn't live on because it lasted, it lives on because for one fierce, shining moment, it outran the impossible. And speaking of ancient threads, let's ride back even further before even the Pony Express was a dream in the hearts of pioneers. The earliest known beer wasn't poured from a bottle in a saloon, it was ladled from a clay pot in the dusty streets of a Sumerian village, thousands of years before Rome rose or the pyramids touched the sky. In ancient Mesopotamia, cradle of civilization, birthplace of agriculture, and home of dusty roads lined with bustling markets, the Sumerians were already brewing beer with both reverence and practicality. Beer wasn't some idle pleasure. It was a daily necessity, a currency, a holy offering to the divine. In a world where water was often suspect, beer was life-saver to drink, and rich in calories to keep laborers working under the blaze of the Mesopotamian sun. It's no accident that the oldest known recipe in human history isn't for bread or soup, it's for beer. Carved into clay tablets around 1800 BCE, the hymn to Ninkasi didn't just sing to a goddess, it laid out the brewing process in verse, a testament to the sacred art of fermentation. Ninkasi wasn't some minor household spirit, she was the goddess of beer itself, worshipped as both provider and protector. The brewing process was a dance of devotion and daily survival. Sumerian brewers baked a special bread called bapur, dense loaves of barley, sometimes sweetened with honey or dates. These loaves were crumbled into clay jars filled with water, where natural fermentation worked its slow, bubbling magic. What emerged wasn't the golden, fizzy drink we know today. It was thick, cloudy, and low in alcohol, more like a soupy bread smoothie than a modern pint. Yet it was essential. Where rivers might carry sickness, beer was a safe sip, a daily staple for everyone from the temple priest to the lowest laborer. Workers digging irrigation canals or hauling stones for ziggurats were paid in beer rations that fueled their bodies and dulled their aches. Beyond its practical use, beer was woven into the spiritual and social fabric of Sumerian life. It was poured out in offerings to the gods, toasted at feasts, and counted in temple ledgers as both currency and sacrament. In a world that saw no separation between the sacred and the everyday, beer was the drink of the living and the language of the divine. So here we are, thousands of years apart, yet bound by a single truth. Connection has always demanded risk, effort, and a kind of sacred endurance. Whether it was the Sumerian brewer stirring cloudy beer in clay pots, or a teenage rider bracing against a freezing prairie wind with a letter in his mochila, each was driven by the same force, the stubborn will to reach across the miles, to connect lives and hearts, and to outrun the impossible. So here's to the riders, the brewers, and all those who dared to believe that distance was a challenge, not a wall. May their stories keep thundering forward, because no matter how fast our wires hum, the oldest and best legends still belong to those who rode through the darkness to deliver a dream. Let me know when you're ready to send the final threads of this story, or if you'd like me to add a postscript, an epilogue, or anything else to bring this journey full circle. All right, gather round, because tonight we're not just telling the story of beer, we're plunging headlong into the ancient rivers of ritual and resilience, where every sip was a toast to survival itself. Let's start in the bustling villages of ancient Sumer, where beer wasn't some quiet evening indulgence, it was the heartbeat of daily life, the sacred brew that turned survival into ceremony. Sumerian beer wasn't poured from frosty mugs in dimly lit taverns. No, it was ladled from hefty clay pots that squatted in the center of bustling homes and dusty courtyards, surrounded by laughter and songs that echoed across the centuries. This was no solitary pleasure. Beer was a communal affair. Neighbors gathered around towering ceramic vats, dipping long reed straws into the thick, cloudy brew, filtering out the gritty sediment as they drank. It wasn't about getting tipsy, it was about binding souls, sharing burdens, and honoring the ancient covenant between grain and gods. In the flickering light of oil lamps, these communal sips weren't just drinks, they were affirmations of life and survival, a daily prayer to the spirits of the harvest. In Sumer, beer was liquid civilization. It pulsed through every corner of life, from the dusty fields to the temple's gilded altars. It was a wage, a blessing, a potion of power and community. You'd find beer and law codes scrawled on clay tablets beside lists of barley quotas and brewing taxes. It spilled into the rhythms of daily work and the grand rituals that knotted a community together. In this ancient world, beer wasn't just something to drink, it was something to revere. From the marshy banks of the Tigris to the windswept edges of the desert, the Sumerians brewed this muddy, nourishing brew in ways that blended the practical with the poetic. Bread was baked dense, sticky loaves of barley and honey called bapur. These loaves were then crumbled into water jars, left to bubble and transform in the warmth of the sun. The result? A thick porridge-like beer that fed both body and soul, a drink that was less about the heady buzz and more about daily strength. But beer's story doesn't stop in Sumer. As the Nile curled its way northward, another ancient kingdom rose and took brewing to a whole new level. In Egypt, beer evolved from a household staple into an industrial powerhouse of drink, so intertwined with life that it became the pulse of an empire. By the time the Old Kingdom's pharaohs were carving their names into stone, beer had become the bedrock of Egyptian society. It was more than a daily drink, it was the golden fuel of the Nile. Temples and palaces pulsed with breweries that churned out thousands of liters, not in dusty backrooms but as part of the state's economic engine. These breweries weren't simple kitchens, they were bustling centers of labor and devotion, staffed by workers who sang to the rhythms of barley and yeast. Beer was a gift from Osiris, the green-skinned god of agriculture and rebirth, and every sip was a quiet prayer to his endless bounty. Temples dedicated vast vats of beer to the gods' offerings that flowed alongside incense and song. In Egypt's pantheon of pleasure, the goddess Hathor reigned supreme, her festivals drenched in sweet, heady brews. Music, dance, and laughter swirled through the air, and beer was the river that carried everyone along. The brewing process itself was both simple and grand. Emmer wheat or barley bread was partially baked, crumbled into jars, and mixed with honey or data sweet offerings to coax out the yeast's gentle fury. Left to ferment in clay vessels, the beer thickened into a drink that was as nourishing as it was intoxicating, so rich in nutrients that archaeologists have dubbed it the ancient Egyptian energy drink. In those sun-baked fields and echoing halls, beer was everything: hydration, nutrition, and the stuff of spiritual union. Beer didn't just sustain the living, it was an offering to the dead. Tombs were stacked high with clay jars, filled to the brim so that pharaohs and farmers alike could toast eternity. Murals in burial chambers showed brewing scenes alongside banquets and prayers, a promise that even in the afterlife, the beer would flow like the Nile itself. For those who built the pyramids, no slaves, but paid laborers, the daily beer ration was as important as bread or onions. Up to 4 liters a day wasn't some indulgence, it was fuel for hauling stones, the weight of ambition itself. Beer was hydration under the sun's pitiless glare, a balm for aching muscles, and a taste of celebration after a day spent defying gravity and time. Women played their part in this brewing tapestry, two especially the priestesses who tended the temple vats. Their hands guided the fermentation process. Their prayers mingled with the sweet, yeasty scent that rose from the jars. In beer, they found a link between the sacred and the daily, an echo of the rhythms that bound all things together. Across the ancient world, beer was never just a drink. It was a divine conduit, a liquid bridge that carried hopes and fears to the gods. Fermentation wasn't chemistry, it was alchemy, a transformation of humble grain into something that could comfort the body and elevate the spirit. In Sumer, the goddess Ninkasi stood at the center of this dance. Her hymn wasn't just a recipe, it was an invocation, a guide for brewing that was part prayer and part practical instruction. Rituals likely began with chants to summon her blessing, and the final beer was poured not just for mortal thirsts, but as libation for the spirits themselves. In Egypt, the spiritual bond went even deeper. Temples brewed their own beer in vast quantities for daily offerings, and during the festival of drunkenness, worshippers honored the myth of Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of destruction. Tricked into drinking beer dyed red to mimic blood, Sekhmet's rage was soothed, and humanity was spared. Beer, in that myth, wasn't just refreshment, it was salvation. So let's raise a mental toast tonight, not just to the frothy pint in our hands, but to the millennia-old dance between grain, gods, and human grit. From the ancient brewers who stirred cloudy jars in temple courtyards to the Pony Express riders who trusted their lives to horses and stars, every chapter of this history is bound by the same stubborn thread: the need to connect, to endure, and to honor the simple miracles of the world. Let me know when you're ready for me to wrap up this journey, or if you'd like an epilogue to tie the legends of the Pony Express and the ancient brewers together in one final, resounding toast. All right, pour yourself a cup of curiosity, because tonight we're traveling deeper into the ancient world, where beer wasn't just a drink, it was a liquid bridge to the gods, a force that could soothe the divine and shape the destinies of entire civilizations. In ancient rituals and seasonal festivals, beer wasn't just a dusty afterthought, it was a sacred offering, a tool of peace and promise. Priests and priestesses didn't just oversee the brewing process, they sang to the bubbling jars, their prayers as essential as the barley itself. In the dusty corners of burial chambers, inscriptions carved in stone listed beer offerings alongside hymns and chants, as if to say, even in death, a soul needs one last taste of the earth's sweet bounty. These ceremonial brews weren't crafted for casual sips, they were spiritual gateways. Large communal gatherings weren't just parties, they were moments when humans reached out to the divine, offering up foamy libations to smooth the path for the living and the dead alike. Whether it was a festival celebrating a harvest, a solemn tribute to ancestors, or a wild solstice night, beer blurred the boundaries between the mundane and the mystical, an ancient toast to the stars. As centuries rolled on and new empires rose, the sacred spark of beer never dimmed. In lands as different as the Hebrews' sunlit hills and the Hittites' rugged strongholds, beer kept its spiritual glow even as wine began to dominate elite rituals. Wine might have been for kings and priests in the hush of temple halls, but beer remained the steady friend of the fields and the working soul forever, tied to fertility, the cycle of planting and reaping, and the gentle heartbeat of the earth itself. This wasn't just about quenching thirst, it was about aligning with the great cosmic rhythms. Every gulp was an echo of the endless cycles of life and death, the turning of seasons, the pull of moon and sun. Beer wasn't a side effect of civilization. It was a cause of itsum, say even the first cause. Imagine this, in the shifting shadows of the ancient Near East, as the first farmers coaxed barley from the dry soil, it wasn't just bread they dreamed of. It was the sweet, comforting buzz of beer. Archaeologists and historians now argue that the desire to brew that bubbling, life-giving drink was one of the sparks that lit the fires of agriculture itself. In the ancient lands of Mesopotamia, where farming first took root, barley was precious not just for bread but for its promise of froth and fermentation. That barley, sturdy, golden, rich with fermentable sugars, could be stored through seasons of plenty and lean. In a world where water was often suspect, beer was life-safe, storable, and sustaining. In the dry lands of Sumer, a sip of beer was a defiance of drought, a small triumph of survival. Brewing beer demanded more than a handful of grain. It called for social harmony tools to grind and bake, vessels to store the frothy dreams, and careful timing to harness the wild magic of fermentation. Brewing became a quiet teacher, fostering knowledge that would shape civilizations. The patient measurement of grain and water, the observation of temperature, and timing all of it long before thermometers or yeast packets. Clay tablets from the heart of Sumer show brewers who understood these mysteries well enough to replicate them, brew after brew, small feat in a world lit only by flickering lamplight. Breweries weren't hidden backrooms, they were pillars of urban life. In cities like Uruk and Babylon, they became woven into the economic and spiritual weave of the state. Rations of beer flowed to soldiers guarding city gates, to laborers hauling bricks for ziggurats, and to bureaucrats tallying grain and taxes. Taxes themselves were often measured in beer, a currency as drinkable as it was practical. Because beer touched everything economy, religion, daily survival, it was watched over with keen eyes and careful record-keeping. From this grew the first bureaucracies, the birth of official measurements and clay tablets filled with lists and ledgers. Beer didn't just stay put. It flowed outward, a liquid ambassador of culture and commerce. Trade routes snaked across deserts and rivers, carrying pots of fermented joy and the knowledge of how to make it. In Levantine ports and Egyptian marketplaces, pottery jars filled with cloudy beer sat alongside goods from distant lands, proof that even in the age of chariots and pharaohs, a shared taste could bring strangers together. So tonight, let's raise a mental toast to those ancient brewers, the clay jars they tended, and the sacred magic they conjured, because in every frothy mouthful, there was more than just grain and water. There was a glimpse of what it meant to be human bound to the land, reaching for the stars and willing to share that journey with anyone who would drink. Let me know if you want to carry this story onward into the legends that come next, or back to the flickering fires where these first brewers learned to turn barley and water into the world's oldest song. Alright, here we are, closing the ancient loop on a drink that wasn't just a pleasure, but a pillar that held up empires, sip by sip. Let's pour this final chapter and drink deep of history's oldest toast. In the earliest days, beer wasn't just a refreshing pause in the day's work, it was a currency, a reason to gather, and a tool for building something bigger than any one household. Beer helped humans settle, organize, and thrive. It fueled the labor of farmers and builders, bridged trade routes, and sweetened the rough edges of survival. In the swirling clay jars of ancient brewmasters, beer was liquid infrastructuria, slow, steady river of connection that wound through dusty city streets and bustling market squares. Long before industrial breweries or carefully guarded recipes, the bubbling of barley and honey was the domain of women. In these ancient cultures, brewing was not the domain of men, it was a woman's art, practiced with the same reverence and skill as weaving or cooking. In Sumerian society, brewing was a sacred duty passed down from mother to daughter like a living spell, each batch an echo of the one before. The goddess Ninkasi, patroness of brewing, was no symbolic figurehead. She was a reflection of reality. Women were the first alchemists, turning muddy grain into golden sustenance. Sumerian women held the keys to both hearth and temple, brewing for household tables and divine altars alike. They worked side by side in kitchen breweries, blending water, bread, and prayers into the drink that fed the soul of a civilization. Men might haggle in the markets and broker deals in the city gates, but it was women who turned barley into beer and grain into life. Across the Nile, Egyptian women carried that tradition forward. In the sunlit homes and bustling courtyards of Egypt's cities, beer was as much a part of life as bread or water. Women brewed in clay pots, stirring the half-baked loaves of emmer wheat into frothy concoctions sweetened with dates or honey. It was a daily task, sometimes traded in local markets, sometimes poured as an offering to gods who demanded both reverence and refreshment. In wealthier homes, brewing was the domain of female servants and workers, each one a quiet keeper of the household's lifeblood. Tomb paintings, still bright with color after millennia, show women brewing and straining, their hands steady as they shaped the drink of life. In temples, priestesses oversaw the brewing of sacred batches ritual beer that was part offering, part prayer. Brewing wasn't just cooking, it was a divine conversation, an act of creation that echoed the cycles of sun and soil. Over time, as cities grew and power shifted, the brewing craft began to slip from women's hands. Beer became a commodity, a trade good, a symbol of status slowly drawn into the orbit of men and commerce. But in those first bubbling pots, it was women who sang to the yeast and guarded the secrets of fermentation. This legacy didn't vanish when empires fell. Even in medieval Europe, echoes of these ancient brewers lived on in the Alevives, women who brewed and sold beer from their kitchens, tall hats marking their presence in the marketplace. Their role would later be twisted into the image of the witch brewing in cauldrons under the moon, but in truth, they were the keepers of an ancient craft, their beer as vital as bread. Ancient brewing wasn't guesswork, it was a careful craft refined by watchful eyes and patient hands. Across cultures, the basic principles of brewing were strikingly similar: grain, water, fermentation, and time. But the methods, oh, the methods, that's where the beauty lay. Barley was the backbone, prized for its fermentable sugars and sturdy stalks. Emmer wheat joined the chorus, especially in Egypt, its nutty richness adding depth to the drink. Brewers partially malted the grain, soaked and sprouted just enough to awaken their sweetness, then ground them into mash or baked them into dense bread loaves meant for brewing. These weren't dinner rolls, they were brewing loaves, baked to capture the warmth of the earth and the breath of yeast. In both Mesopotamian and Egyptian traditions, these bread loaves were crumbled into massive clay vats, their rough edges softened by water drawn from wells or rivers. Brewers stirred the mixtures by hand, sometimes boiling them to coax out every last grain sweetness. Then they left the jars to the work of the air-natural yeast, drifting down like invisible spirits to spark the fermenting magic. No one knew the word yeast, but they knew which pots worked best. They could tell by the bubbling, by the hiss of gases that meant life was stirring. Certain vessel solder, cracked with memory, were prized for their secret colonies of yeast, carried forward in every batch. To flavor and sweeten the beer, brewers added the fruits of their land, sticky dates that clung to fingers, golden honey that glowed in the sun, sharp herbs that sang of distant mountains. Egyptian beer, especially, was often thick and sweet a meal in itself for the laborers who stacked stones into pyramids or coaxed green life from desert sands. Some versions were so rich they had to be eaten with a spoon, thick as porridge and twice as satisfying. Filtration was a luxury, not a given. Some beers were drunk through reed straws, the drinker leaning over the rim of a ceramic jar to sip at the smooth top layer and leave the sediment to settle. Others were gulped straight from cups, sediment and a la gritty, honest drink that stuck to the ribs. In these hot, arid climates, brewing was more than a recipe. It was a dance with the seasons and the sun. Brewers timed their work to the cool of dawn or the shade of cellars, knowing that a sudden shift in heat could ruin a whole batch. Cool pits and earthen jars kept the fermenting beer safe from the fierce midday heat, a patient answer to a climate that gave no quarter. So here's to the ancient brewers' women, who watched the grain swell and the yeast wake, who fed both gods and mortals with every bubbling jar. In a world of shifting sands and endless skies, they brewed not just to quench thirst, but to nourish the soul and weave the first fragile threads of civilization itself. Let me know if you'd like me to carry this thread forward, maybe into the evolution of brewing in the medieval world, or into the modern echoes of these ancient potions. Wherever we go next, the song of barley and honey still hums in the background, waiting for someone to raise a cup and listen. All right, friends, let's wander into the final chapter of this ancient brewing saga where beer left the cozy hearth of the home and marched straight into the heart of ancient economies, sealing its role as the golden thread that tied life and labor together. In shaded courtyards, brewers worked their craft with precision honed over generations. They learned how to control the temperature of their bubbling jars, sometimes by nesting them in cool earth, other times by warming them carefully on stone hearths that crackled with the scent of wood smoke. In some places, beer was carefully aged in sealed clay, jars capped with wax or cloth to keep out the heat and the hungry spirits of the air. In others, beer was meant to be drunk fresh, still lively with a chatter of yeast and the sweet breath of barley. The tools of the trade were simple yet cunning: wide-mouthed clay vats, wooden paddles polished by countless hands, woven sieves that sifted the brew from the mash, and stone hearths that coaxed warmth into each bubbling jar. Everything was made by hand, no two vessels exactly the same, no two batches quite alike. And yet, the knowledge that shaped these jars and filled them with life was not lost to the ages. It was passed down in whispers and chants, preserved in the lilting verses of songs like the hymn to Ninkasia rhythm that taught both prayer and practice. Far from crude guesswork, these ancient brewing techniques were marvels of adaptation tailored to the rhythms of the sun, the breath of the wind, and the needs of the soil. They were more than recipes. They were living blueprints for transforming the simplest of ingredients into a drink that could feed the soul and steady the hands of a working world. As beer became a part of every meal and every prayer, it also seeped into the very bones of ancient economies. In places like Mesopotamia, beer was currency as much as it was comfort. It was the daily wage of builders who carved canals from stubborn earth, of scribes who bent over clay tablets in the hush of temple libraries. Workers of every rank, stone haulers, field hands, temple guards received beer as payment, measured out in clay cups or heavy jugs, thick or refined according to their standing. Records carved in the flowing curves of cuneiform preserve these daily transactions lists of grain measured, beer allotted, debts paid in frothy drafts. Thousands of these ancient receipts still survive, a testament to a time when beer was as precious and practical as silver itself. Brewing was no small affair. It took an army of hands to turn barley into beer, grain collectors who walked dusty fields under the sun, millers who ground the harvest to powder, bakers who shaped bread that was never meant for tables, fermenters who watched the vats with a priest's patience, and porters who carried clay jars down twisting roads to markets and storehouses. In some regions, whole towns specialized in brewing, developing local styles that were as distinctive as a potter's mark. These ancient beers weren't bottled or branded like they are today, but they traveled just the same, swaddled in clay, sealed tight with wax or linen, and carried down river routes and trade trails. Beer was swapped for wool from mountain pastures, for olive oil that glowed like liquid gold, for the pottery that cradled the drink itself. It was a currency of comfort, a soft-spoken barter that crossed cultures and kingdoms. Egypt's breweries mirrored this thriving brew-based economy. In bustling cities and dusty rural estates alike, brewing was woven into the very structure of the state. Temples and granaries were home to sprawling breweries that poured out beer for festivals and funerals, for temple rites, and for the daily pay of the workers who shaped Egypt's golden dreams. Beer was tracked and taxed like any strategic resource. Pharaoh's scribes marked out jars of beer with the same precision as they measured barley bushels and counted cattle. In lean times, beer was a fallback currency liquid wealth that could trade for grain or cloth, a promise of life in a cup. Archaeologists have found clay vessels with the faint, sticky fingerprints of these ancient brewers, from the Levant to Cyprus, even down to Nubia's riverlands. Beer flowed across these trade routes not as a luxury, but as the people's drink thick, nourishing, and sweet with the labors of the land. While the high tables of kings might have glistened with wine, it was beer that filled the clay cups of farmers and builders, that slaked the thirst of traders and soldiers, that blessed both hearth and temple. Beer was daily bread in liquid form, rich with calories, bright with the laughter of yeast, and humble enough to carry the weight of survival. Its perishability meant it was almost always locale product of the land, a testament to the hands that brewed it. But within those foamy edges was a promise that transcended borders. Beer wasn't just something you drank, it was something that carried you through the day, that paid for your bread, that offered a pause in the churn of the world. So here's to those ancient brewers, the mothers and daughters who stirred clay jars in Sumerian courtyards, the priestesses who watched over temple vats in Egypt's sun-drenched shrines. Here's to the traders who loaded jars onto donkey carts, bound for markets beyond the horizon, and to the workers who raised their cups at dusk, grateful for another day's strength. Beer wasn't merely consumed, it was counted, cherished, and woven into the very weave of civilization itself. Let me know if you're ready to see where the foam of history flows next, because there are still so many stories to sip and share. So let's raise a glass to the final swirl of this ancient Talia tale, where every sip was both sustenance and statement, where beer was the currency of empires and the quiet voice of the earth itself. Beer was more than a drink. It was a fuel for dreams traded, stored, and spent like liquid coin. It built the pyramids that still cast shadows across golden sands. It bankrolled temples, feeding the priests who spoke to the gods. It kept empires, strong grain turned to courage, yeast turned to wealth. A mug of beer might have cost a few copper coins, but behind it lay the heartbeat of an entire Scythian invisible river of labor and faith that flowed from farm to festival, from market square to temple gate. Beer, in the ancient world, was the great equalizer. Everyone drank it, from dusty laborers to high priests with gold in their brows. But make no mistake, not everyone drank the same brew. Just like food, clothing, and the way people spoke, beer reflected and enforced the ironclad social hierarchies of the day. In the bustling streets of Sumerian and Akkadian cities, beer was a daily rationale, promised that even the humblest worker could find relief at the end of a long day in the fields or at the kiln. These weren't refined sips. These were dense, hearty brews, thick enough to stand a spoon in, more like a meal than a drink, rich with grain and sweat and sun. A functional beer, a laborer's beer sturdy, filling, and honest. But even here, the foam told a story. Ancient clay tablets whisper of at least 9 types of beer, each carefully ranked, each served for a purpose. The simplest was for the common man, thick, cloudy, and rough. The best was saved for scribes whose pens shaped policy, for priests who whispered prayers at dawn, for administrators who tallied taxes in flickering torchlight. A better beer was more than a better drink, it was a line in the sand, a quiet declaration that some lives were meant to taste finer things. In Egypt, the split was even sharper. Everyday folk farmers in the shadow of the pyramids, builders hauling stones in the sun, drank a beer thick with emmer wheat, sweetened with dates that stuck to the tongue. It was hearty, a meal in a cup, fuel for bodies worn by work. But for the wealthy, beer was a thing of butia, lighter, golden brew, sweet as a summer dusk, and smooth enough to drink by moonlight. Tomb paintings tell the story. Nobles in shaded courtyards, goblets of beer in hand, servants moving like water to keep the cups brimming. For them, beer wasn't survival, it was celebration, a way to taste power itself. Pharaohs didn't just drink beer, they had it poured for them in daily rites, an offering as sacred as the morning sun. Alongside wine and bread, beer was part of the ritual that bound king to cosmos, that whispered to the gods of Egypt's right to rule. The finest grains, the clearest waters, the softest honeybees belonged to the pharaoh and his chosen few. Beer was also a tool of diplomacy, a liquid promise passed between leaders at feasts and treaty tables. A cup of fine beer was a sign of respected gesture that said, "We are equals," or "I honor your gods as I honor my own." And if no beer was offered, that was no accident. It was a slighter way to say that the guest was unwelcome or unworthy of the drink that sweetened the soul. In the shadows of temples and the glow of palace halls, beer was brewed with the same care that built pyramids and carved laws. It was both food and luxury, both daily bread and the stuff of legends. From dusty hands to golden goblets, beer told the story of a world where every sip was a prayer and every brew a quiet testament to survival. So here's to the ancient brewers and the hands that lifted those heavy clay jar shears, to the drink that bridged the gap between laborer and king, that turned grain into glory, that made strangers into neighbors and neighbors into kin. Let me know if you'd like to continue tracing the echoes of this ancient drink into the Middle Ages, the modern pint, or the quiet clinks of glasses raised in memory of those first frothy dreams. All right, let's lean in closer, because we're at the final frothy crest of this ancient tale where beer wasn't just a drink. It was a mirror that reflected everything from status to spirit. The brewing profession itself showed the same divide that cut through every courtyard and marketplace. In the small homes and bustling village squares, it was women, sometimes slaves, sometimes wives or daughters, who stirred the pots and watched the grains bubble to life. They brewed the daily beer, thick and nourishing, that carried families through the sweat of fields and the hush of twilight. Brewing was part of the hearth's quiet, dancing, everyday magic of barley and water that kept the world turning. But climb the steps to temple altars, or walk the echoing halls of elite estates, and the brewing art took on a new face. Here, brewing wasn't just a household career, it was a craft, a profession. Professional brewers softened, salaried, and trained like any other artisan watched over the sacred vats. In these temple breweries, beer was more than a meal, it was an offering to the gods and a testament to the wealth and power of those who ruled. These beers were better regulated, carefully taxed, and infused with the politics of grain and gold. So, beer was universal, yes, but it was never the same drink twice. For some, it was a lifeline thick and sustaining, the bread that flowed. For others, it was a golden luxury, a drink of refinement and divine whispers. Every jar, every sip carried more than just the taste of barley and honey. It carried a silent signature of class and calling, of whether your days were spent beneath the sun or behind temple walls. And yet, in that foam, there was something that transcended the divide, because beer, for all its different textures and meanings, was still a shared language. From the muddy banks of Sumer to the cool courtyards of Thebes, it was a link that bound laborer and priest, merchant and king, a common thread woven through 1,000 different lives. Thousands of years have passed since Sumerian priestesses sang to Ninkasi, their prayers rising with the steam of clay pots. Since Egyptian workers raised their clay cups beneath the watchful eyes of the pharaoh's tombs. But the echoes of that brewing magic still hum in every pint and pour today. In our recipes where we malt the grains, coax yeast to life, and flavor our brews with sweet fruit and bitter herbs, we taste the ancient world's genius. In our rituals, whether raising a toast at a wedding or gathering with friends on a quiet night, we channel the old belief that beer is a bond, a bridge between the living and the gods. In our economies, beer still fuels commerce and conversation, as it once did in the crowded markets of and Memphis. Modern brewing owes everything to those first fearless brewersmen and women who had no microscopes or thermometers, only their eyes, their ears, and their patient hands. They learned to trust the warmth of the clay, the scent of the air, and the quiet music of the bubbling jars. They were farmers, cooks, alchemists. And with every batch they brewed, they weren't just making beer, they were making civilization itself. So here's to the ancient brewers and the living threads they wove, jar by jar. Let me know if you'd like to keep traveling, maybe to medieval brewing halls or modern craft breweries where the old magic still flickers, waiting to be tasted again. Let's close this ancient chapter with one final toasto, the quiet power of beer and the voices of those who brewed it. Intuition, tradition, and patient experimentation, these were the true tools of the first brewers. Guided by songs and whispered tales, they shaped a craft that would one day become a science. No thermometers, no fancy glass flasks, just the senses of those who knew how barley should smell, how clay jars should sound when they bubbled with life. These early methods were not just born of guesswork. They were built from careful watching, sacred practices, and the slow rhythm of trial and error. Today, that ancient attitude still lingers in the corners of the world where time moves a little slower. In Ethiopia's highlands, in Peru's dusty fields, and in the quiet kitchens of Eastern Europe's villages, beer is still brewed in clay jars or battered pots. Recipes passed from grandmother to granddaughter, flavor woven into the songs of the family. In these places, brewing isn't just work or hobby, it's a ritual, a heartbeat of the community, echoing the old kitchens of Sumer and Egypt. Look closely at festivals around the globe, and you'll see the same spirit in every foaming cup. Beer is still the drink of celebration, the quiet promise of fellowship. From the roaring Oktoberfest tents in Munich to the backyard barbecues of America's heartland, from ancient solstice gatherings to modern wedding feast, beer remains a bridge, a way to say, we're together, and this moment matters. Even the humble pint at the local pub carries the same echo of those first communal pots. The friends gathered around a battered table might as well be sharing reeds at a Sumerian jar, because beer, at its heart, has always been about connection. A liquid bond that turns strangers into neighbors, neighbors into kin. Academically, the story of beer is not just folklore, it's a growing science. Bioarchaeologists are now peeling back the millennia, scraping residue from ancient clay to reveal what these early brews were really like. In labs that smell of hops in history, they reconstruct the recipes of pharaohs and priestesses. Some have even revived ancient beer, selling them in modern bottles, offering drinkers a literal taste of the past. Experimental archaeologists stand where the first brewers stood, testing old grains, watching the dance of yeast that once fed empires. But beyond the bubbling vats and carefully measured enzymes, there's a bigger truth. Beer wasn't just a product, it was a foundation. Civilization was not only built by kings with armies or priests with prayers. It was built by women who stirred the mash in temple courtyards, by laborers who raised clay cups to the rising sun, by merchants who traded jars of golden brew across mountains and seas. Beer turned water into safety, grain into wealth, moments into memories. So the next time you raise a glass, no matter if it's a frothy pint in a crowded bar or a clay cup passed around a fire know that you're not just drinking beer. You're taking part in an unbroken ritual that stretches back 5,000 years. A legacy that began with barley and clay, with women in shadowed kitchens and priests chanting hymns in the cool hush of temples. You're sipping history itself, grain and water, yeast and patience brewed by generations who understood that even the simplest drink can carry the weight of the world. Here's to that legacy still bubbling, still alive, still waiting to be tasted with every pour. Let me know if you'd like to explore how these ancient brews influenced later brewing revolutions, or if you'd like to dive into the echoes of this story in modern craft beer culture. The journey, like the brew, is far from over.